Psychology of the Masses and Analysis of the Self. Sigmund Freud. Psychology of the Masses and Analysis of the Self. Introduction. The opposition between individual psychology and social or collective psychology, which at first sight may seem very profound, loses much of its significance as soon as we submit it to a closer examination. Individual psychology is certainly specific to isolated man and investigates the paths by which he himself tries to achieve the satisfaction of his instincts, but only very rarely and under certain exceptional conditions, is it given to dispense with the individual's relations with his similar. In the individual psychic life, the other always appears integrated, effectively, as model, object, helper or adversary, and in this way, individual psychology is at the same time and from the beginning, social psychology, in a broad sense. But fully justified. The relationships of the individual with his parents and siblings, with the person he loves and with his doctor, that is, all those that up to now have been the object of psychoanalytic research, can aspire to be considered as social phenomena, placing them then in opposition to certain other processes, called, by us, narcissistic, in which the satisfaction of the instincts eludes the influence of other people or dispenses with them at all. In this way, the opposition between social and narcissistic psychic acts, Bleuler would perhaps say, autistic, falls within the domain of social or collective psychology. In these relationships with his parents and siblings, with a loved one, a friend, and a doctor, the individual appears to us under the influence of a single person or, at most, of a small number of persons, each of whom has acquired an extraordinary importance for him. However, when speaking of social or collective psychology, it is customary to dispense with these relationships, taking only as the object of the investigation the simultaneous influence exerted on the individual by a large number of people to whom he is bound by certain ties, but who, apart from this, may be alien to him from many other points of view. Thus, collective psychology considers the individual as a member of a tribe, a town, a house, a social class or an institution, or as an element of a human multitude, which at a given moment and with a determined end, is organized in a mass or community. Broken, thus, a natural bond, it was already easy to consider the phenomena arisen in the particular circumstances previously indicated, as manifestations of a special irreducible instinct, of the social instinct, herd instinct, group mind which does not arise abroad in other situations. However, we must object that it is difficult for us to attribute sufficient importance to the numerical factor to provoke, by itself, in the human soul, the awakening of a new instinct, inactive on all other occasions. Our attention is thus directed towards two different possibilities, namely, that the social instinct is not a primary and irreducible instinct, and that the beginnings of its formation can be found in more limited circles, for example, that of the family. Collective psychology, despite being still in its early stages, covers an incalculable number of problems, which do not even appear sufficiently differentiated yet. Only the classification of the various forms of collective groupings and the description of the psychic phenomena externalized by them require a great effort of observation and exposition and have already given rise to an extensive literature. The comparison of the modest proportions of the present work with the amplitude of the domains of collective psychology, will already make the reader assume, without further warning on my part, that only some points of such a vast subject are studied in it. And in reality, it is that only a small number of the questions that it entails, are of special interest to the psychoanalytic investigation of the depths of the human soul. The collective soul, according to L. E. Bohn. We could start with a definition of the collective soul, but it seems more rational to present, first of all, to the reader, a general exposition of the corresponding phenomena and to choose among these some of the most singular and characteristic ones, which can serve as a starting point for our research. We will achieve both ends by taking as a guide a work that enjoys fair celebrity, The Psychology of Crowds by Gustavo L. E. Bohn. First of all, it will be convenient for us to make ourselves present, with maximum clarity, the question raised. Psychology, which pursues the instincts, dispositions, motives, and intentions of the individual, even his actions and in his relations with his fellow men. Having reached the end of its work and having shed light on all its objects, would see rise before she, suddenly, a new problem. It would, in effect, explain the surprising fact that in certain circumstances, arising from his incorporation into a human crowd that has acquired the character of a psychological mass, that same individual whom he has managed to make intelligible, thinks, feels and acts in a completely unexpected way. Now, what is a mass? By what means does he acquire the power to exert such a decisive influence on the individual mental life? And what is the psychic modification that it imposes on the individual? The answer to these questions, a task that will be easier starting with the third and last, is the responsibility of collective psychology, whose object is, in fact, the observation of the modifications given to individual reactions. However, any attempt at explanation must be preceded by the description of the object that is to be explained. We will therefore leave the floor to Gustavo Le Bon, the most singular of the phenomena presented by a psychological mass is. The following, whatever the individuals that make it up and however diverse or similar their way of life, their occupations, their character, or their intelligence may be, the simple fact of being transformed into a crowd endows them with a kind of collective soul. This soul makes them feel, think, and act in a completely different way than each of them would feel, think, and act alone. Certain ideas and certain feelings do not arise nor are transformed into acts but in individuals constituted in a multitude. The psychological mass is a provisional being made up of heterogeneous elements, welded together for an instant, exactly as the cells of a living body form a new being by their union, whose characteristics are very different from those that each of such cells possesses. Allowing us to interrupt Le Bon's exposition with our glosses, we will insert here the following observation: if the individuals that form part of a crowd are fused into a unit, there must be something that links them to each other, and this something could very well be that which characterizes the mass. But Le Bon leaves this question open, and turning to the modifications that the individual undergoes in the mass, he describes them in terms very consistent with the fundamental principles of our depth psychology. It is easy to see how greatly the individual integrated in a crowd differs from the isolated individual. What is already more arduous is to discover the causes of said difference. In order to get at least a glimpse of them, it is necessary first of all to recall the observation made by modern psychology, that not only in organic life, but also in the functioning of the intelligence, unconscious phenomena play a preponderant role. The conscious life of the spirit appears to be very limited compared to the unconscious. The most subtle analyst, penetrating observer, never discovers more than a small part of the unconscious motives that guide them. Our conscious acts derive from an unconscious substratum, formed, for the most part, by influences. Hereditary, the substratum contains the innumerable ancestral residues that constitute the soul of the race. Behind the confessed causes of our actions, there are secret causes, unknown to all. Most of our daily acts are the effect of hidden motives that escape our knowledge. Le Bon thinks that in a crowd, individual acquisitions are erased, thus disappearing the personality of each one of those who make it up. The social unconscious emerges first, and the heterogeneous merges into the homogeneous. We will say, then, that the psychic superstructure, so diversely developed in each individual, is destroyed, the uniform unconscious base common to all appearing naked. In this way, an average character would be formed of the individuals constituted in a multitude. But Le Bon finds that such individuals also display new qualities, which they lacked before, and finds the explanation for this phenomenon in three different factors. The appearance of characters peculiar to multitudes appears to us determined by various causes. The first of these is that the individual integrated into a crowd, acquires, by the simple fact of number, a feeling of invincible power, thanks to which he can allow himself to give in to instincts that, before, as an isolated individual, he would have forcibly restrained. and he will give in to such instincts all the more willingly since the crowd is anonymous, and consequently irresponsible. The feeling of responsibility, a powerful and constant brake on individual impulses, will disappear for him. Our point of view exempts us from attaching great value to the appearance of new characters. Suffice it to say that the individual who becomes part of a crowd finds himself in conditions that allow him to suppress the repressions of his unconscious tendencies. The apparently new characteristics that it then manifests are precisely externalizations of the individual unconscious, the system in which it is contained. In germ all the evil existing in the human soul. The disappearance, in these circumstances, of the conscience or the feeling of responsibility, is a fact whose comprehension offers us no difficulty, since a long time ago, we observed that the nodule of what we call moral conscience was social anguish. A second cause, mental contagion, also intervenes to determine in crowds the manifestation of special characters, and at the same time, their orientation. The contagion is an easily verifiable phenomenon, but still unexplained, and that has to be linked to the hypnotic order phenomena, whose study we will undertake in later pages. Within a crowd, every feeling and every act is contagious, to the point that the individual very easily sacrifices his personal interest to the collective interest, an attitude contrary to his nature and to which man is only susceptible when he is part of a crowd. Crew. A third cause, the most important, determines in the individuals integrated into a mass, special characters, sometimes very opposed to those of the isolated individual. I refer to suggestibility, of which the aforementioned contagion is, moreover, but an effect. To understand this phenomenon, it is necessary to take into account certain recent discoveries in physiology. Today we know that an individual can be transferred to a state in which, having lost his conscious personality, he obeys all the suggestions of the operator who has made him lose it and commits the most contrary acts to his character and customs. However, careful observations seem to show that the individual immersed for some time in the bosom of an active crowd soon falls, as a consequence of the effluvia that emanate from it or for any other cause, still unknown, in a particular state, very similar to that of the crowd. State of fascination of the hypnotized in the hands of his hypnotist. Once the cerebral life of the hypnotized subject is paralyzed, he becomes a slave to all his unconscious activities, which the hypnotist directs at will. The conscious personality disappears, will and discernment are abolished. Feelings and thoughts are then oriented in the direction determined by the hypnotist. Such is, approximately, the state of the individual in a crowd. He is no longer aware of his actions. In him, as in the hypnotized, certain faculties are abolished and others can be brought to an extreme degree of exaltation. The influence of a suggestion will launch you with irresistible impetus, to the execution of certain acts. Impetus even more irresistible in crowds than in the hypnotized subject, since the suggestion being the same for all individuals, it will intensify when it becomes reciprocal. Thus, then, the disappearance of the conscious personality, the predominance of the unconscious personality, the orientation of feelings and ideas in the same direction, by suggestion and contagion, and the tendency to immediately transform suggested ideas into acts, they are the main characters of the individual integrated into a crowd. Lost all his personal traits, he becomes an automaton without a will. We have quoted these passages in their entirety, to show that Le Bon is not limited to comparing the state of the individual integrated into a crowd with the hypnotic state, but rather establishes a true identity between the two. We do not intend to contradict this theory here, but we do want to point out that the two last mentioned causes of the transformation of the individual into the mass, contagion, and greater suggestibility, cannot be considered as of the same nature, since, in the opinion of our author, contagion is, in turn, but a manifestation of suggestibility. Thus, it must seem to us that Le Bon does not establish a sufficiently precise differentiation between the effects of these two causes. The best way to interpret his thought will be, perhaps, by attributing contagion to the reciprocal action exerted by the members of a crowd on one another and deriving the suggestion phenomena identified by Le Bon with those of hypnotic influence, from a different source. But which one? We must recognize as an obvious gap the fact that one of the main terms of this identification, namely, the person who for the crowd replaces the hypnotist, does not appear mentioned in Le Bon's exposition. In any case, the author distinguishes from this fascinating influence, which leaves in the shadows, the contagious action that individuals exert on each other and that comes to reinforce primitive suggestion. We will cite yet another very important point of view for the judgment of the individual integrated into a crowd. By the mere fact of being part of a crowd, then, man descends several steps on the scale of civilization. In isolation, he was perhaps a cultured individual; in crowds, he is instinctive, and therefore a barbarian. It has the spontaneity, the violence, the ferocity, and also the enthusiasms and heroism of primitive beings. The author then particularly insists on the decrease in intellectual activity that the individual experiences due to his dissolution in the mass. Let us now leave the individual and move on to the description of the collective soul, carried out by Le Bon. There is not a single point in this description whose origin and classification could present difficulties to the psychoanalyst. Le Bon also shows us the way by himself, highlighting the coincidences of the soul of the crowd with the mental life of primitives and children. The crowd is impulsive, versatile, and irritable and is guided almost exclusively by the unconscious. The impulses to which he obeys can be, according to the circumstances, noble or cruel, heroic or cowardly, but they are always so imperious that the personality and even the self-preservation instinct disappear before them. Nothing, in it, is premeditated. Even when he passionately wants something, he never wants it for long, for he is incapable of a persevering will. It does not tolerate any postponement between the wish and the realization. She harbors a feeling. Fear of omnipotence. The notion of the impossible does not exist for the individual who is part of a crowd. The crowd is extraordinarily impressionable and gullible. She lacks a critical sense and the implausible does not exist for her. He thinks of images that are associatively linked to each other, such as those states in which the individual gives free rein to his imagination without any rational instance intervening to judge to what extent his fantasies are adapted to reality. The feelings of the crowd are always simple and exalted. In this way, he knows no doubts or uncertainties. The crowds quickly reach the extreme. The enunciated suspicion becomes ipso facto indisputable evidence. A principle of antipathy becomes, in seconds, a fierce hatred. Naturally prone to all excesses, the crowd only reacts to very intense stimuli. To influence it, it is useless to argue logically. Instead, you will need to present vividly colored images and repeat the same things over and over again. Not entertaining the slightest doubt about what they believe to be true or what is wrong and also possessing a clear awareness of their power, the crowd is as authoritarian as it is intolerant. It respects strength and sees in goodness nothing more than a kind of weakness that impresses very little. What the mob demands of its heroes is force and even violence. It wants to be dominated, subjugated, and fear its master. The crowds harbor, deep down, irreducible conservative instincts, and like all primitives, a fetishistic respect for traditions and an unconscious horror of novelties capable of modifying their conditions of existence. If we want to form an exact idea of the morality of crowds, we must bear in mind that in the gathering of individuals integrated into a mass, all individual inhibitions disappear, while all cruel, brutal, and destructive instincts, residues of ages primitive, the strong in the individual, they wake up and seek their free satisfaction. But under the influence of suggestion, the masses are also capable of selflessness and sacrifice for an ideal. Personal interest, which constitutes almost the only motive for action of the isolated individual, does not appear in the masses as a dominant element, except on very few occasions. One can even speak of a moralization of the individual by the masses. While the intellectual level of the crowd always appears to be much lower than that of the individual, Its moral conduct can either exceed the individual ethical level or fall far below it. Some features of the characteristic of the masses, as L. E. Bone explains to him, show to what extent the identification of the soul of the multitude with the soul of the primitives is justified. In the masses, the most opposed ideas can coexist without hindering each other and without any conflict arising from their logical contradiction. Now, psychoanalysis has shown that this same phenomenon also occurs in individual mental life, thus, in the child and in the neurotic. In addition, the crowd is very accessible to the truly magical power of words, which are capable of both provoking the most violent storms in the collective soul, as well as appeasing it and restoring its calm. Reason and arguments cannot do anything against certain words and formulas. Pronounced with seclusion before the crowds, they cause respect to be painted on all faces and all foreheads to bow. Many consider them as forces of nature or as supernatural powers. For this purpose it is enough to remember the taboo of names among the primitives and the magical forces that for them are linked to names and words. Finally, the multitudes have never known the thirst for truth. They demand illusions, which they cannot give up. They always give preference to the unreal over the real, and the unreal acts on them with the same force as the real. They have a visible tendency not to make a distinction between the two. This predominance of the imaginative life and of the illusion sustained by unsatisfied desire has already been pointed out by us as a characteristic phenomenon of the psychology of neuroses. We find, in effect, that for the neurotic general objective reality has no value and only psychic reality does. A hysterical symptom is based on a fantasy and not on the reproduction of something truly lived. An obsessive feeling of guilt rests on the real fact of a bad intention never carried out. As happens in dreams and in hypnosis, the test for reality succumbs, in the psychic activity of the mass, to the energy of desires charged with affectivity. What L. E. Bone says about the directors of crowds is less satisfactory and does not allow the normative to show so clearly. Our author believes that as soon as a certain number of living beings come together, be it a herd or a human crowd, the individual elements instinctively place themselves under the authority of a chief. The crowd is a docile herd incapable of living without a master. He has such a thirst to obey that he instinctively submits to the one who sets himself up as his boss. But if the mob needs a leader, he or she must possess certain personal skills. He must also be fascinated by an intense faith in an idea, in order to arouse faith in the crowd. Likewise, he must possess a powerful and imperious will, capable of animating the crowd, lacking in itself will. L. E. Bone then talks about the different kinds of crowd managers and the means with different kinds of crowd managers and the means with which they act on them. In the last analysis, he sees the cause of their influence in the ideas by which they themselves are fascinated. But also, both to these ideas and to the directors of crowds, L. E. Bone attributes a mysterious and irresistible power, to which he gives the name of prestige. Prestige is a kind of fascination that an individual, a work or an idea, exert on our spirit. This fascination paralyzes all our critical faculties and fills our soul with wonder and respect. The feelings then provoked are inexplicable. Like all feelings, but probably of the same order as the suggestion experienced by a magnetized subject. L. E. Bone distinguishes an acquired or artificial prestige and a personal prestige. The first one that gives conferred on people, by name, their wealth, or their honor, and on doctrines and works of art, by tradition. Since it always has its origin in the past, it does not help us in the least to understand this mysterious influence. Personal prestige is an adornment that very few enjoy, but these few are imposed by the very fact of possessing it, as bosses, and are made to obey as if they possessed a magical talisman. In any case, and whatever its nature, prestige always depends on success and disappears in the face of failure. It cannot but be noted that L. E. Bone's considerations of crowd managers and the nature of prestige do not measure up to his brilliant description of the collective soul. Other conceptions of the collective soul life. We have used Gustavo L. E. Bone's exposition as a starting point because it coincides considerably with our psychology in the accentuation of the unconscious psychic life. But now we have to add that, in reality, none of the affirmations of this author offer us something new. His contemptuous appreciation of the manifestations of the collective soul has already been expressed in equally precise and hostile terms by other authors and repeated, since the most remote times of literature, by countless thinkers, poets, and statesmen. The two principles that contain the most important points of view of L. E. Bohn, that of the collective inhibition of the intellectual function and that of the intensification of affectivity in the crowd, were formulated a short time before by Seyle. Thus, the only thing unique to L. E. Bohn is his conception of the unconscious and his comparison with the psychic life of primitives, although he was not without precursors on these points either. But there is more. L. E. Bohn and others' description and appreciation of the collective soul have not remained free of objection. Undoubtedly, all the previously described phenomena of the collective soul have been exactly observed, but it is also possible to oppose other manifestations of the collective formations, completely contrary to them and likely to suggest a higher valuation of the soul of the multitudes. L. E. Bohn himself is ready to concede that under certain circumstances, the morality of crowds can be higher than that of the individuals that compose it, and that only collectivities are capable of great selflessness and a high spirit of solidarity. Sacrifice. Personal interest, which constitutes almost the only motive for action of the isolated individual, does not appear in the masses as a dominant element but on very few occasions. Other authors highlight the fact that society is the one that imposes moral norms on the individual, generally incapable of rising to them on their own, or affirm that in exceptional circumstances, the phenomenon of enthusiasm arises in the community, which he has trained multitudes for the noblest and most generous acts. With regard to intellectual production, it is, on the other hand, demonstrated that the great creations of thought, the capital discoveries and the decisive solutions of great problems, are not possible except for the isolated individual who works in solitude. However, the collective soul is also capable of giving life to spiritual creations of a brilliant order, as proven, firstly, by language, and later by popular songs, folklore, etc. It would also have to be specified how much the thinker and the poet owe to the stimuli of the masses and if they are really something more than the perfecters of a mental work in which the others have collaborated simultaneously. In the presence of these apparently irreducible contradictions, it seems that the work of collective psychology must be sterile. However, it is not difficult to find a path full of hope. Probably very different formations have been confused under the generic denomination of crowds, among which it is necessary to establish a distinction. The data of Seyle, L. E. Bohn, and others refer to masses of temporary existence, quickly constituted by the association of individuals moved by a common interest, but very different from each other. It is undeniable that the characters of the revolutionary masses, especially those of the French Revolution, have influenced their description. On the other hand, the opposite affirmations derive from the observation of those other stable masses or permanent associations, in which men spend their entire lives and which take shape in institutions. Social. The multitudes of the first category are to those of the second what brief but high waves are to the immense surface of the sea. M.C. Dougal, who in his book The Group Mind, Cambridge, 1920, starts from the same contradiction mentioned above, resolves it by introducing the organization factor. In the simplest case, he says, the mass, group, has no organization or only a rudimentary organization. To this disorganized mass, he gives the name of multitude, crowd. However, he confesses that no human group can be formed without a certain beginning of organization and that it is precisely in these simple and rudimentary masses that some of the fundamental phenomena of collective psychology can most easily be observed. For the accidentally assembled members of a human group to come to form something similar to a mass, in the psychological sense of the word, it is a necessary condition that there is something in common between the individuals, that the same interest binds them to the same object, that experience the same feelings in the presence of a given situation and, consequently, I would add, that possess, to a certain extent, the faculty of influencing one another, some degree of reciprocal influence. between the members of the group. The more energetic this mental homogeneity is, the more easily individuals will form a psychological mass and the more evident will be the manifestations of a collective soul. The most singular and at the same time most important phenomenon of the formation of the mass consists of the exaltation or intensification of the emotionality in the individuals that integrate it. It can be said, says M.C. Dougal, that there are no other conditions in which human affections reach the intensity they do in a crowd. In addition, the individuals of a crowd experience a voluptuous sensation when they surrender unlimitedly to their passions and melt into the mass, losing the feeling of their individual delimitation. M.C. Dougal explains this absorption of the individual by the mass by attributing it to what he calls the principle of the direct induction of emotions by means of primitive sympathetic reaction, that is, to what with the name of contagion of affects is already known to us psychoanalysts. The fact is that the awareness of the signs of an affective state is capable of automatically provoking the same affect in the observer. This automatic obsession is all the more intense the greater the number of people in whom the same affect is simultaneously observed. Then, the individual becomes incapable of maintaining a critical attitude and allows himself to be invaded by the same emotion. But by sharing the excitement of those whose influence has acted on him, he in turn increases that of the others, and in this way, the affective charge of the individuals integrated into the mass is intensified by reciprocal induction. Something like an obsession is undeniably at work here, which drives the individual to imitate others and to keep in tune with them. The grosser and more elemental the emotions, the more likely they are to spread in this way in a mass. This mechanism of affective intensification is favored by various other influences emanating from the crowd. The mass gives the individual the impression of unlimited power and invincible danger. It replaces, for the moment, the entire human society, incarnation of authority, whose punishments have been meted out and for which we impose so many restrictions on ourselves. It is obviously dangerous to stand in front of it, and to guarantee their own safety, each one must follow the example they see around them, and even, if necessary, go so far as to howl with the wolves. Obedient to the new authority, we will have to silence our previous conscience and thus yield to the attraction of the pleasure that we will surely achieve by the cessation of our inhibitions. It will not, therefore, surprise us, that the individual integrated into a mass does or approves things from which he would have distanced himself in the ordinary conditions of his life, and we can even hope that this fact allows us to shed some light on the darkness of that which we designate in the enigmatic word suggestion. M.C. Nor does Dougal deny the principle of the collective inhibition of intelligence in the mass. He believes that the intelligences, the lower ones, attract the higher ones to their own level. The latter see their activity hampered because the intensification of affectivity creates, in general, unfavorable conditions for intellectual work. Secondly, because the individuals, intimidated by the crowd, see said work restricted, and thirdly, because in each one of the individuals integrated into the mass the awareness of responsibility is diminished. The joint judgment that M.C. Dougal's formulation on the psychic function of simple disorganized multitudes is not much more favorable than L.E. Bond's. For him, such a crowd is exceedingly excitable, impulsive, passionate, versatile, inconsistent, indecisive, and at the same time inclined to go to the greatest extremes in its action, accessible only to violent passions and elementary feelings, extraordinarily easy to suggest, superficial in his reflections, violent in his judgments, capable of assimilating only the simplest and most imperfect arguments and conclusions, easy to lead and move. She lacks any sense of responsibility and respectability, and she is always ready to allow herself to be carried away by the awareness of her strength to violence typical of absolute and irresponsible power. He thus behaves like a rude child or like a passionate and unguarded savage in an unfamiliar situation. In the most serious cases, it behaves more like a herd of wild animals than a gathering of human beings. Since M.C. Dougal opposes to this attitude that of the multitudes who have a superior organization, we will wait impatiently to find out what such an organization consists of and what are the factors that favor its establishment. The author enumerates 5 of these capital factors, 5 main conditions necessary to raise the level of the psychic life of the multitude. The first condition, and the essential one, consists of a certain measure of continuity in the composition of the dough. This continuity can be material or formal, the first, when the same people are part of the crowd, during a space of more or less prolonged time, the second, when certain situations develop within the mass that are successively occupied by different people. Secondly, it is necessary that each one of the individuals of the mass have formed a certain idea of the nature, the function, the activity, and the aspirations of the same, an idea from which an effective attitude will be derived for him with respect to it, to the entire mass. Thirdly, the mass must be in relation to other similar collective formations, but different, however, in various aspects, and even rival it. The fourth condition is that the mass has its own traditions, uses and institutions, relative, above all, to the reciprocal relations of its members. Finally, the fifth condition is that the crowd has an organization that manifests itself in the specialization and differentiation of the activities of each of its members. The fulfillment of these conditions would make disappear, according to M.C. Dougal, the psychic defects of the collective formation. The collective decrease of the intellectual level would be avoided by taking the solution of the intellectual problems away from the multitude, to entrust it to the individuals. In our opinion, the condition that M.C. Dougal designates the organization of the multitude, it could be described, more justifiably, in a different way. It is a matter of creating in the mass the faculties that are precisely characteristic of the individual and that the latter has lost as a result of being absorbed by the crowd. The individual possessed, of course, before joining the primitive mass, his continuity, his conscience, his traditions and customs, his peculiar field of action and his special modality of adaptation, and he kept himself separated from others with whom he rivaled. All these qualities he has temporarily lost by joining the unorganized crowd. This tendency to endow the multitude with the attributes of the individual reminds us of the profound observation of W. Trotter, who sees, in the tendency to form masses, a biological expression of the polycellular structure of higher organisms. Suggestion and libido. We have started from the fundamental fact that the individual integrated into a crowd experiences, under its influence, a modification, sometimes very profound, of his mental activity. His affectivity is extraordinarily intensified and, on the other hand, his intellectual activity is markedly limited. Both processes tend to equalize the individual with the rest of the crowd, an end that can only be achieved by the suppression of the inhibitions peculiar to each one and the renunciation of the individual and personal modalities of the tendencies. We have seen that these effects, often undesirable, can be neutralized, at least in part, by a superior organization of the masses, but this possibility leaves standing a fundamental fact of collective psychology, that is, the elevation of affectivity and intellectual coercion in the primitive mass. Our work will be directed, then, to find the psychological explanation of the psychic modification that the influence of the mass imposes on the individual. Obviously, the intervention of rational factors, such as the intimidation of the individual by the crowd, that is, the action of his self-preservation instinct, is not enough to explain the observed phenomena. What outside of this offer us, by way of explanation, the authorities in sociology and psychology of the masses, is always reduced, although presenting under different names, to the same thing, summed up in the magic word suggestion. One of these authors, Tard, speaks of imitation, but for our part we unreservedly subscribe to the opinion of Brueghels, who considers imitation integrated into the concept of suggestion, as a consequence of it. Le Bon reduces all the singularities of social phenomena to 2 factors, the reciprocal suggestion of individuals and the prestige of the leader. But prestige is not exactly externalized but rather by the faculty of provoking suggestion. Reading M.C. Dougal, we were able to experience, for a few moments, the impression that his principle of primary effective induction made it possible to dispense with the suggestion hypothesis. But reflecting more carefully, we must recognize that this principle only expresses the well-known phenomena of imitation or the contagion, although decidedly accentuating the effective factor. Undoubtedly, there is in us such a tendency to experience those affects whose signs we observe in others, but how many times do we successfully resist it, rejecting the affect and even reacting in quite the opposite way? And if this is the case, why do we always give in to contagion when we are an integral part of the crowd? We will have to tell ourselves again that it is the suggestive influence of the crowd that forces us to obey this tendency to imitate and induces affection in us. But, even leaving all this aside, MC does not allow us either. Dougal dispense with suggestion, because like many other authors, he tells us that the masses are distinguished by a special suggestibility. In this way, we are prepared to admit that suggestion, or more exactly, suggestibility, is an irreducible primary phenomenon, a fundamental fact of human mental life. This was the opinion of Bernheim, whose astonishing experiments I witnessed firsthand in 1889. But I also remember experiencing, at that time, a dark animosity against such a tyranny of suggestion. When I heard Bernheim questioning a not very docile patient with the words, "What are you doing? Vous contre suggestionner?" he told me that this constituted an injustice and violence. The subject had an obvious right to counter-suggestion when attempts were made to dominate him through suggestions. This resistance of mine later took the form of a rebellion against the fact that the suggestion, which explained everything, should in itself be devoid of explanation, and I repeated to myself, referring to it, the old humorous question. Christoph trug Christum, Christus trug die ganz Welt, sag, wo hat Christoph damals in den Fuss gestalt? Christophorus Christum. Sed Christus astulit orbum. Constitueret pedibus dic ubi Christophorus? Now, when after 30 years of distance, I return to approach the enigma of suggestion, I find that nothing has changed in it, except for a single exception, which testifies precisely to the influence of psychoanalysis. I observe, in effect, in the investigators, a particular commitment to correctly formulate the concept of suggestion, that is, to conventionally establish the use of this term. Of course, this is not superfluous, since the word suggestion acquires an increasingly imprecise meaning with use and will soon end up designating any influence, as is already the case in English, the language in which the words to suggest and suggestion correspond to are Nahelegen, to prompt, and Anregung, stimulus. But on the essence of suggestion, that is, on the conditions in which influences lacking a sufficient logical foundation are established, no clarification has been given yet. I could strengthen this statement by analyzing the works published on the subject in the last 30 years, but I do not do so because I know that in a sector close to my activity, a detailed investigation is being prepared on this subject. On the other hand, we will try to apply to the clarification of collective psychology, the concept of libido, which has already provided us with such good services in the study of psychoneurosis. Libido is a term belonging to the theory of affectivity. We designate with it the energy considered as a quantitative magnitude, although for now not measurable, of the instincts related to everything that can be understood under the concept of love. The core of what we call love is constituted, naturally, by what is generally designated by that word and is sung by poets, that is, by sexual love, whose ultimate goal is sexual copulation. But on the other hand, we do not separate from such a concept what participates in the name of love, that is, on the one hand, the love of the individual for himself, and on the other, paternal and filial love, friendship and love for the humanity in general, to concrete objects or to abstract ideas. Our justification lies in the fact that psychoanalytic research has taught us that all these tendencies are the expression of the same instinctive movements that impel the sexes towards sexual union, but that in different circumstances they are diverted from this sexual goal or stopped in their tracks the achievement of the same, although conserving enough of its essence to keep its identity recognizable. Abnegation, Tendency to approach. We believe, then, that with the word love, in its multiple meanings, language has created a perfectly justified synthesis, and that we can do no better than take it as the basis for our discussions and scientific expositions. With this agreement, psychoanalysis has unleashed a storm of indignation, as if it had been guilty of a sacrilegious innovation. And yet, with this conception amplified of love, psychoanalysis has not created anything new. Plato's Eros presents, as regards its origins, its manifestations, and its relationship with sexual love, a perfect analogy with the loving energy, that is, with the libido, of psychoanalysis, a coincidence fully demonstrated by Nachmanson and Pfister in interesting works. And when the Apostle Paul praises love in his famous epistle to the Corinthians and places it above all things, he surely conceives it in the same amplified sense, from which it follows that men do not always take their great thinkers seriously, even though they seem to greatly admire them. These erotic instincts are called in psychoanalysis a posteriori, and due to their origin, sexual instincts. The majority of cultivated men have seen in this denomination an offense, and he has taken revenge on it by launching the accusation of pansexualism at psychoanalysis. Those who regard sexuality as shameful and humiliating to human nature may use the more distinguished terms eros and erotism. That way I could have done it too from the beginning, something that would have saved me numerous objections. But I have not done it because I do not like to give in to pusillanimity. You never know where such a path might lead you. You begin by giving in to words, and sometimes you end up by giving in to things. I see no merit in being ashamed of sexuality. The Greek word eros, with which one wants to veil the shameful, is not, after all, but the translation of our word love. Besides, he who knows how to wait has no need to make concessions. We will try, then, to admit the hypothesis that in the essence of the collective soul there are also loving relationships, or to use a neutral expression, affective ties. Let us remember that the authors cited up to now do not speak a single word on this issue. What corresponds to these love relationships appears hidden in them behind the suggestion. Our hope rests on two ideas. Firstly, that the mass must be held together by some power. And to what power is it possible to attribute such a function if not to eros that maintains the cohesion of everything that exists? Secondly, that when the individual included in the mass renounces what is personal and allows himself to be influenced by others, we experience the impression that he does so because he feels the need to find himself in agreement with them and not in opposition to them, that is, out of love for others. Two artificial masses, the Church and the Army. Regarding the morphology of the masses, we will remember that we can distinguish very different varieties, and very divergent and even opposite directions in their formation and constitution. There are, in effect, ephemeral multitudes and other very lasting ones, homogeneous, that is, composed of similar individuals, and not homogeneous, natural and artificial or in need of external coercion, primitive and differentiated, with a high degree of organization. But for reasons that will appear later, we will particularly insist here on a differentiation to which the authors have not yet given sufficient attention. I am referring to that of those masses that lack directors and those that, on the contrary, have them. And in complete opposition to the generally adopted custom, we will not choose as the starting point of our investigations a collective and relatively simple formation, but artificial, lasting and highly organized masses. The Church and the Army are artificial masses, that is, masses on which an external coercion acts aimed at preserving them from dissolution and avoiding modifications of their structure. In general, it does not depend on the will of the individual to enter or not to form part of them, and once inside, the separation is subject to certain conditions whose non-compliance is rigorously punished. The question of knowing why these associations need such guarantees does not interest us at the moment, but rather the circumstance that these crowds, highly organized and protected in the indicated way, against disintegration, reveal certain particularities that in others they remain hidden or concealed. In the Church, and it will be very advantageous for us to take the Catholic Church as our own, and in the Army, reigns, whatever their differences in other aspects, the same illusion, the illusion of the visible or invisible presence of a leader, Christ, in the Catholic Church, and the general-in-chief in the army, who loves all members with equal love of the collectivity. Everything depends on this illusion, and its disappearance would bring with it the disintegration of the Church or the army, to the extent that external coercion would allow it. The equal love of Christ for all his faithful is clearly expressed in the words, "Truly I tell you, as soon as you did it to one of these my little brothers, you did it to me." For each of the individuals that make up the believing crowd, Christ is a kind older brother, a substitute for the Father. From this love of Christ derive all the demands that are placed on the individual believer, and the democratic breath that animates the Church depends on the equality of all the faithful before Christ and their identical participation in divine love. It is not without profound reason that the Christian community is compared to a family, and the faithful are considered as brothers in Christ, that is, as brothers because of the love that Christ professes for them. In the bond that unites each individual with Christ we must indisputably see the cause of the one that unites individuals among themselves. The same is true in the army. The boss is the father who loves all his soldiers equally, which is why they are comrades with each other. From the point of view of structure, the army differs from the Church in the fact that it is made up of a hierarchy of masses of this order. Each captain is the general-in-chief and the father of his company, and each non-commissioned officer, of his section. The Church also presents such a hierarchy, but it no longer plays the same economic role in it, since it must be assumed that Christ knows his faithful better than the general knows his soldiers and cares more about them. Against this conception of the army's libidinous structure, it will be rightly objected that it completely ignores the ideas of homeland, national glory, etc., so important for the cohesion of the army. In response to this objection, we will argue that this is a different and much less simple case of collective training, and that the examples of great captains, such like Caesar, Wallenstein, and Napoleon, demonstrate that these ideas are not essential for the maintenance of the cohesion of an army. Later, we will deal briefly with the possible substitution of the boss by a directing idea and the relations between the latter and the former. The negligence of this libidinous factor in the army seems to constitute, even in those cases in which it is not the only one at work, not only a theoretical error but also a practical danger. Prussian militarism, as anti-psychological as German science, has perhaps experienced the consequences of such an error, in the Great War. The war neuroses that disintegrated the German army represented a protest by the individual against the role assigned to him in the army, and according to E. Simmel's communications, it can be affirmed that the rudeness with which the commanders treated their men constituted one of the main causes of such neuroses. If the aforementioned libidinous aspiration of the soldier had been more attended to, the fantastic promises of the 14 points of the American president would probably not have found such easy credibility, and the German military chiefs, artists of war, would not have seen each other break their hands the magnificent instrument they had. We will have to keep in mind that in the two artificial masses that we have been dealing with, the Church and the army, the individual is doubly linked by libidinous ties, in the first place, to the boss, Christ or the general, and also, to the remaining individuals of the community. Later we will investigate the relationships between these two orders of ties, seeing whether or not they are of equal nature and value and how they can be described psychologically. But from now on we think we can already reproach the authors for not having paid enough attention to the importance of the director for the psychology of the masses. On the other hand, we have placed ourselves in more favorable conditions, due to the choice of our first object of investigation, and we believe that we have found the path that will lead us to the explanation of the fundamental phenomenon of collective psychology, that is, the lack of freedom of the individual in a crowd. If each of such individuals is linked by solid ties, effective, to two different centers, it should not be difficult for us to derive from this situation the modification and limitation of his personality, generally observed. The phenomenon of panic, observable in the military masses with greater clarity than in any other collective formation, also shows us that the essence of the crowd consists of the libidinous ties existing in it. Panic occurs when such a crowd begins to break up and is characterized by the fact that the orders of the bosses are no longer obeyed, each individual no longer caring but himself, without paying attention to others at all. Thus broken the reciprocal ties, an immense and senseless fear arises. Naturally, it will be objected to us here, that we invert the order of phenomena and that it is fear that, growing excessively, imposes itself on all kinds of ties and considerations. M.C. Dougal has even used the case of panic, although not the military, as a model example of his theory of the intensification of affects by contagion, primary induction. But this rationalist explanation is absolutely unsatisfactory, since what it tries to explain is precisely why fear has come to take on such gigantic proportions. This cannot be attributed to the magnitude of the danger, since the same army that at a given moment succumbs to panic, may have faced, undaunted, much greater dangers on other nearby occasions, and the essence of panic lies precisely in its lack of relation to the danger that threatens, and trigger, sometimes, by insignificant causes. When the individual, integrated into a crowd in which panic has arisen, begins to think only of himself, he thereby shows that he has become aware of the tearing of affective ties that until then diminished the danger in his eyes. Now that he is already isolated before him, he has to esteem him higher. It turns out, then, that panic fear presupposes the relaxation of the libidinal structure of the mass and constitutes a justified reaction to it, the contrary hypothesis being erroneous, that the libidinal ties of the mass are destroyed by fear of danger. These observations do not contradict the claim that collective fear grows to immense proportions under the influence of induction, contagion. This theory of M.C. Dougal is accurate in those cases in which the danger is really great and there are no solid effective ties in the mass, circumstances that occur, for example, when a fire breaks out in a theater or meeting room. But the most instructive case and best adapted to our purposes is that of an army corps invaded by panic in the face of a danger that does not exceed the ordinary measure and that has been faced on other occasions with perfect serenity. Certainly the word panic does not have a precise and unequivocal determination. Sometimes it is used to designate collective fear, others it is applied to individual fear, when it exceeds all measure, and others, finally, it seems reserved for those cases in which the explosion of fear is not shown to be justified by the circumstances. Giving it the sense of collective fear, we can establish a broad analogy. The individual's fear can be caused by the magnitude of the danger or by the rupture of affective ties, locations of the libido. This last case is that of neurotic anxiety. In the same way, panic is produced by the intensification of the danger that threatens everyone or by the breaking of the affective ties that guaranteed the cohesion of the mass, and in the latter case, collective anxiety presents multiple analogies with neurotic anxiety. Seeing, as M.C. Dougal, in panic, one of the most characteristic manifestations of the group mind, one arrives at the paradox that this collective soul would dissolve by itself in one of its most obvious expressions, since panic undoubtedly means disintegration of the crowd, resulting in the cessation of all the considerations that the members of the crowd previously held for each other. The typical cause of a panic explosion is very similar to that offered by Nestroy in his parody of Hebel's drama Judith and Holofernes. In this parody, a warrior shouts, "The chief has lost his head," and all the Assyrians flee. Without the danger increasing, the loss of the boss is enough in any sense for panic to arise. With the tie that tied them to the chief, those that tied the individuals to each other generally disappear and the mass pulverizes like a small Bolognese bottle whose tip breaks. The disintegration of a religious mass is already more difficult to observe. I recently had the opportunity to read an English novel of a Catholic spirit and recommended by the Bishop of London When It Was Dark in which such an eventuality and its consequences are described, with as much skill in my opinion as accuracy. Consequences. The author imagines a conspiracy, hatched in our days, by enemies of the person of Christ and of the Christian faith, who claimed to have managed to discover in Jerusalem a tomb with an inscription in which Joseph of Arimathea confesses having stolen, for pious reasons, 3 days after his burial, the corpse of Christ, transferring it from its first burial to that other. This archaeological discovery means the ruin of the dogmas of the resurrection of Christ and his divine nature, and brings with it the shock of European culture and an extraordinary increase in all crimes and violence, until the day that the conspiracy hatched by the forgers is discovered and denounced. What appears in the course of this supposed decomposition of the religious mass is not fear, for which every pretext is lacking, but selfish and hostile impulses, which the common love of Christ for all men had previously prevented from manifesting itself. But even during the reign of Christ there are individuals who are outside of such effective ties, those who are not part of the community of believers, do not love Christ or are loved by him. For this reason, all religion, even if it is called a religion of love, must be harsh and loveless towards all those who do not belong to it. Deep down, every religion is such a religion of love for its followers, and instead, cruel and intolerant for those who do not recognize it. As difficult as this may be for us personally, we must not reproach the believer too much for his cruelty and intolerance, an attitude that the unbelievers and the indifferent can adopt without encountering any psychological obstacle. If such intolerance, it does not manifest itself today in such a cruel and violent way as in previous centuries, we should not see in it a sweetening of the customs of men. The cause lies rather in the undoubted weakening of religious feelings and the effective ties dependent on them. When a different collective formation is substituted for the religious one, as the socialist one now seems to achieve, the same intolerance that characterized religious struggles will arise against those who remain outside it, and if the existing differences between scientific conceptions could acquire the eyes of the multitudes an equal importance, we would see produced, for the same reasons, the same result. Other problems and orientations. So far, we have investigated 2 artificial masses, and we have found that they appear to be dominated by 2 different orders of affective ties, of which those that link individuals to the chief appear to be more decisive, at least for them, than those that link individuals with each other. However, in the morphology of the masses, there would still be much to investigate and describe. It would be necessary to begin by establishing that a simple gathering of men does not constitute a mass as long as the aforementioned ties do not occur in it, although we would have to confess, at the same time, that in any gathering of men the tendency to form psychological mass. We would then have to pay attention to the various masses, more or less permanent, that form spontaneously, and study the conditions of their formation and decomposition. First of all, we would be particularly interested in the difference between the masses who have a director and those who do not. Thus, we would investigate whether the former are not the most primitive and perfect. If in the latter the director cannot be found replaced by an idea or abstraction, the religious masses, obedient to an invisible head, would constitute the type of transition, and also if a tendency or a desire capable of being shared by a large number of people, could not also constitute such a substitution. The abstraction could, in turn, incarnate more or less perfectly in the person of a secondary director, and then very diverse and interesting relationships would be established between the boss and the idea. The director or the directing idea could also have a negative character, that is, hatred towards a certain person or institution, could act analogously to positive affect and provoke similar affective ties. Likewise, we would have to ask ourselves if the director, it is really indispensable for the essence of the mass, etc., etc. But all these questions, some of which have already been studied in works on collective psychology, do not divert our interest from the fundamental psychological problems that the structure of a mass poses for us. And above all, a reflection arises in us that shows us the shortest way to arrive at the demonstration that the characteristic of a mass is found in the libidinous ties that cross it. We will try to represent how men behave towards each other from the affective point of view. According to the famous parable of the numb porcupines, Scapenhauer's Parega und Paralipomena, Part 2, XXXI, Gleichnis und Parabeln, no man bears too close an approach to others. On a bitter winter's day, the porcupines of a herd huddled close together for mutual warmth. But in doing so, they hurt each other with their spikes, and they had to separate. Forced to get together again, due to the cold, they pricked each other again and distanced themselves. These alternatives of approaching and moving away lasted until it was given to them to find an average distance in which both evils were mitigated. According to the testimony of psychoanalysis, almost all intimate affective relationships, of some duration, between two people, marriage, friendship, parental and filial love, leave a deposit of hostile feelings, which requires, in order to disappear, the process of repression. This phenomenon is most clearly shown to us when we see two associates quarreling continuously or the subordinate gossiping incessantly against his superior. The same thing occurs when men come together to form larger ensembles. Whenever two families are united by marriage, each considers itself better and more distinguished than the other. Two neighboring cities will always be rivals and the most insignificant canton will look down on price to neighboring cantons. Related ethnic groups repel each other. The German from the south cannot stand the German from the north. English speaks contemptuously of Scotch and Spanish despises Portuguese. The greater the differences, the more difficult it becomes to master aversion, and thus we have ceased to wonder at what the Gauls feel for the Germans, the Aryans for the Semites, and the whites for men of color. When the hostility is directed against loved ones, we say that it is an affective ambivalence, and we explain the case, probably in an overly rationalist way, by the numerous pretexts that very intimate relationships offer for the birth of conflicts of interest. In the feelings of revulsion and aversion that arise without any disguise against strangers with whom we find ourselves in contact, we can see the expression of a narcissism that tends to assert itself and behaves as if the slightest deviation from its individual properties and characteristics implied a critique of them and an invitation to modify them. What we do not know is why such a great sensitivity is attached to these details of differentiation. Instead, it is undeniable that this behavior of men reveals a disposition to hate and aggressiveness, to which we can attribute an elemental character. But all this intolerance disappears, fleetingly or durably in the masses. While the collective formation is maintained, the individuals behave as if cut from the same pattern. They tolerate all the peculiarities of others, consider themselves equal to them, and do not experience the slightest feeling of aversion. According to our theories, such a restriction of narcissism can only be caused by a single factor, by the libidinous link to other people. Selfishness finds no limit except in love for others, love for objects. We will be asked here if the simple community of interests would not be enough by itself and without the intervention of any libidinous element, to inspire the individual tolerance and consideration with respect to others. To this objection, we will reply, that in this way, a permanent limitation of narcissism cannot be produced, since in associations of this kind, tolerance will only last as long as the immediate benefit produced by the collaboration of others lasts. But the practical value of this issue is less than we might believe, since experience has shown that even in cases of simple collaboration, libidinous relationships are regularly established between comrades, which go beyond the purely practical advantages obtained by each, of collaboration. In the social relations of men we find again those facts that psychoanalytic research has enabled us to observe in the course of the development of the individual libido. The libido is based on the satisfaction of the great individual needs and chooses, as first objects, those people who intervene in it. In the development of humanity, as in that of the individual, it is love that has revealed itself to be the main factor of civilization, and perhaps even the only one, determining the passage from egoism to altruism. And both sexual love for women, with the need derived from it, to protect everything that was pleasing to the female soul, as well as desexualized, homosexual, sublimated love for other men, love that is born from common work. Thus, when we observe that restrictions of narcissistic egoism arise in the crowd, non-existent outside of it, we will have to consider this fact as proof that the essence of collective formation lies in the establishment of new libidinous ties between the members of the group. Same. The problem that we are faced with here is that of what the nature of such new affective ties can be. In the psychoanalytic theory of the neuroses, we have dealt almost exclusively up to now with the ties that unite those erotic instincts that still pursue direct sexual ends, with their corresponding objects. In the multitude, obviously, it cannot be a question of such ends. We are here before erotic instincts that, without losing any of their energy, appear deviated from their primitive purposes. Now, already within the limits of ordinary sexual fixation to objects, we have observed phenomena that correspond to a deviation of the instinct from its sexual end, and we have described them as degrees of the loving state, recognizing that they involve a certain limitation of the ego. In the pages that follow, we are going to examine with particular attention these phenomena of falling in love, with the hope, founded, in our opinion, of deducing from them conclusions applicable to the affective ties that the masses go through. In addition, we would like to find out if this kind of fixation to an object, as we observe it in sexual life, is the only existing type of affective attachment to another person, or if we will have to take other mechanisms into account. Now, psychoanalysis reveals to us precisely the existence of these other mechanisms of affective bonding by discovering identifications, processes that are still insufficiently known and difficult to describe, the examination of which will keep us away from our main theme, collective psychology, for some time. The identification. Identification is known to psychoanalysis as the earliest manifestation of an affective bond with another person, and it plays an important role in the prehistory of the Oedipus complex. The boy manifests a special interest in his father. I would like to be like him and replace him in everything. We can therefore say that he makes his father his ideal. This conduct does not represent, in any way, a passive or feminine attitude towards the father, or towards men in general, but is strictly masculine and reconciles very well with the Oedipus complex, to whose preparation it contributes. Simultaneously with this identification with the father, or somewhat later, the child begins to take his mother as the object of his libidinous instincts. It shows, then, two orders of links, psychologically different. One, frankly sexual to the mother, and an identification with the father, whom he considers as a model to imitate. These two links coexist for some time without influencing or hindering each other. But as psychic life tends towards unification, they get closer, until they end up meeting, and from this confluence the normal Oedipus complex is born. The child notices that the father is blocking the path to the mother, and his identification with him acquires a hostile nuance, ending up merging into the desire to replace him close to the mother as well. The identification is, moreover, from the beginning, ambivalent, and can materialize, both in an affectionate expression and in the desire for suppression. It behaves like a ramification of the first phase, the oral phase, of the organization of the libido, during which the subject incorporated the desired and esteemed object, eating it, and in doing so, destroyed it. It is known that the cannibal has remained in this phase. He loves his enemies, that is, he likes them, or he esteems them, to eat them, and he eats only those whom he loves from this point of view. Later, we lose sight of the destinations of this identification with the father. It may happen that the Oedipus complex undergoes an inversion, that is, that by adopting the subject of feminine attitude, the father becomes the object from which the direct sexual instincts await their satisfaction, and in this case, the identification with the father constitutes the preliminary phase of his conversion into a sexual object. This same process presides over the daughter's attitude toward her mother. It is not difficult to express in a formula this difference between the identification with the father and the choice of him as a sexual object. In the first case, the father is what he would like to be, in the second, what you would like to have. The difference is, then, that the interested factor is the subject or the object of the I. For this reason, identification is always possible before any choice of object. What is already much more difficult is to construct a concrete metapsychological representation of this difference. All that we verify is that the identification aspires to conform one's own self analogously to the other taken as a model. In a neurotic symptom, the identification is linked to a more complex set. Let us suppose the case that the daughter contracts the same pathological symptom that torments the mother, for example a persistent cough. Well, this identification can result from two different processes. It can be, firstly, the same as the Oedipus complex, meaning, therefore, the hostile desire to replace the mother, and then, the symptom expresses the erotic inclination towards the father and makes the desired substitution, but under the direct influence of the consciousness of guilt. Didn't you want to be your mother? You've already got it? At least you already experience their same sufferings. Such is the entire mechanism of the formation of hysterical symptoms. But it can also happen that the symptom is the same as the loved one. Thus, in our fragment of the analysis of a hysteria, Dora imitates her father's cough, and then we will have to describe the situation by saying that the identification has taken the place of the choice of object, transforming this, by regression, into an identification. We already know that identification represents the earliest and most primitive form of affective bonding. Under the conditions that preside over the formation of symptoms, and therefore repression, and under the regime of the mechanisms of the unconscious, it often happens that the choice of the object becomes identification again, the I absorbing the qualities of the object. The singular thing is that in these identifications, the I sometimes copies the unloved person, and other times, instead, the loved one. It must also seem strange to us that in both cases, the identification is only partial and highly limited, being satisfied with taking a single feature of the person object. In a third, particularly frequent and significant case of symptom formation, the identification takes place independently of any libidinous attitude towards the copied person. When, for example, a young student of a boarding school receives, from her secret love, a letter that arouses her jealousy and to which she reacts with a hysterical attack, some of her friends, aware of the facts, will be victims of what we could call the psychic infection and will suffer, in turn, an equal attack. The mechanism we are witnessing here is that of identification, made possible by the attitude or the will to place oneself in the same situation. Others may also have a secret love affair and accept, under the influence of their guilt, the suffering associated with it. It would be inaccurate to say that it is out of sympathy that they assimilate their friend's symptom. On the contrary, sympathy is born solely from identification, and proof of this is that such infection or imitation also occurs in cases where there is less sympathy between the two people than can be supposed between two fellow students in a boarding house. One of these has noticed in the other an important analogy at a certain point. In our case it is an equally pronounced degree of sentimentality. Immediately, an identification occurs at this point, and under the influence of the pathogenic situation, this identification moves to the symptom produced by the imitated ego. Identification by means of the symptom thus marks the point of contact of the two is, a meeting point that had to be kept repressed. The lessons drawn from these three sources can be summarized as follows. First, identification is the primitive form of affective attachment to an object. Second, following a regressive direction, it becomes a substitution for a libidinous link to an object, as by introjection of the object into the ego. And third, it can arise whenever the subject discovers in himself a common trait with another person who is not the object of his sexual instincts. The more important such a community is, the more perfect and complete the partial identification can become and thus constitute the beginning of a new link. We already suspect that the reciprocal link of the individuals of a mass is of the nature of such an identification, based on a broad affective community, and we can suppose that this community rests on the modality of the link with the leader. We also note that we are still very far from having exhausted the problem of identification and that we are facing the process called sympathetic projection, Einfühlung, by psychology, a process on which depends, for the most part, our understanding of the self of others. But having to confine ourselves here to the immediate affective consequences of identification, we will leave aside its significance for our intellectual life. Psychoanalytic research, which has also occasionally dealt with the difficult problems of psychosis, has been able to verify the existence of identification in some other cases, difficult to interpret. We will present here, in detail, two of these cases, as material for our further reflections. The genesis of homosexuality is very often the following: the young man has remained fixated on his mother, in the sense of the Oedipus complex, for a longer period than usual and very intensely. With puberty, then comes the time to exchange the mother for another sexual object, and then there is a sudden change of orientation. The young man does not renounce the mother, but identifies with her, transforms into her and looks for objects capable of replacing his own ego, already those who love and care as he has been loved and cared for by his mother. This is not a rare process, which can be verified as many times as desired and which, naturally, does not depend at all on the hypotheses that can be built on the organic impulsive force and the reasons for such a sudden transformation. The most unique thing about this identification is its breadth. The I is transformed in a very important order, in the sexual character, according to the model of that other that up to now constituted its object, the object then being lost or abandoned, without for the moment being able to discuss whether the abandonment is total or permanent. Preserved the object in the unconscious. The substitution of the abandoned or lost object, by identification with it, that is, the introjection of this object into the I, are facts that we already know, having had the opportunity to directly observe them in childhood. Thus, the Internationale Zeitschrift für Psychoanalyse has recently published the case of a child who, saddened by the death of a kitten, soon declared that he was now said animal and began to walk on all fours, refusing to eat on the table, etc. The analysis of melancholy, a condition that counts among its most obvious causes the real or effective loss of the loved object, offers us another example of this introjection of the object. One of the main characteristics of these cases is the cruel self-humiliation of the I, together with implacable self-criticism and the most bitter reproaches. Analysis has shown that these reproaches and criticisms are basically directed against the object, and represent the vengeance that the ego takes on it. The shadow of the object has fallen on the self, we have said elsewhere. The introjection of the object is here evidently clear. But these melancholies show us something else, which may be very important for our further considerations. They show us the self divided into two parts, one of which relentlessly fights the other. This other one is the one that has been transformed by introjection, which entails the lost object. But the part that is so cruel with the previous one is not unknown to us either. It encloses in itself the moral conscience, a critical instance located in the self and that also in normal times has critically confronted it, although never so implacably and unfairly. Already on other occasions, due to narcissism, sadness and melancholy, we have had to construct the hypothesis that such an instance develops in our self, which can be separated from the other self and come into conflict with it. We gave this instance the name of the I ideal, ich ideal, and we assigned to it, as functions, self-observation, moral conscience, dream censorship and the main influence in repression. We also said that it was the eris of primitive narcissism, in which the infantile I was self-sufficient, and that little by little it was taking, from the influences of the environment, the demands that it posed to the I and that it did not always it could satisfy, so that when man became dissatisfied with himself, he could find his satisfaction in the ideal of the ego, differentiated from the ego. We also established that in the delusion of self-observation, the decomposition of this instance becomes evident, thus revealing its origin in the influences exerted on the subject by the authorities that have weighed on him, his parents, in the first place. But we do not forget to add that the distance between this ideal of the I and the actual I is highly variable, depending on the individual, and that in many of them, such differentiation within the I does not exceed the limits that it presents in the child. But before we can use these materials for the intelligence of the libidinous organization of a mass, we will have to consider some other reciprocal relations between the object, the ego. In love and hypnosis, the usual language always remains faithful to any reality, even in its whims. Thus, he designates with the name of love very diverse affective relationships, which we also theoretically gather under such a concept, but leaving in doubt if this love is genuine and true. It points to a whole scale of possibilities within amorous phenomena, a scale that should not be difficult for us to discover. In a certain number of cases, falling in love is nothing more than a coding of an object by the sexual instincts, a coding aimed at achieving direct sexual satisfaction and which disappears with the achievement of this end. This is what we know as ordinary or sensual love. But we know very well that the libidinous situation does not always present this lack of complication. The certainty that the newly satisfied need would not take long to reappear, must have been the immediate reason for the persistence of the covering of the sexual object even in the intervals in which the subject did not feel the need to love. The singular evolution of human erotic life offers us a second factor. The boy found, during the first phase of his life, a phase that extends up to the age of 5, his first erotic object in his mother, the girl in her father, and on this first erotic object were concentrated all his sexual instincts that aspired to find satisfaction. The subsequent repression forced the renunciation of most of these infantile sexual purposes and left behind a profound change in the child's relationship with his parents. From then on, the child remains linked to his parents, but with instincts that we can describe as restricted in their ends. The feelings that from this point he experiences towards such loved ones are qualified as tender. It is known that previous sexual tendencies, they are conserved with more or less intensity in the unconscious, so that the original total current endures in a certain sense. With puberty, new very intense tendencies arise, oriented towards direct sexual ends. In the least favorable cases, they remain separated from the permanent tender sentimental directions, as a sensual current. We obtain, then, that painting whose two aspects have been so frequently idealized by certain literary orientations. The man shows a passionate inclination towards women who inspire him with high respect, but who do not incite him to love commerce, and instead, he is only powerful with other women whom he does not love, esteem in little or even despise. But more often than not, the young man manages to achieve, to a certain extent, the synthesis of spiritual and asexual love with earthly sexual love, his attitude towards the sexual object being characterized by the joint action of free instincts and instincts restricted in its end. By the part corresponding to the instincts of tenderness restricted in its end, the degree of falling in love can be measured as opposed to that of simple sensual desire. Within this infatuation, we have been interested from the beginning by the phenomenon of sexual overestimation, that is, the fact that the loved object remains in a certain way subtracted from criticism, all its qualities being estimated at a higher value than when he was not yet loved or those of indifferent people. Given a somewhat effective repression or retention of sensual tendencies, the illusion arises that the object is also loved sensually because of its psychic excellences, when, on the contrary, it is the influence of sensual pleasure that has led us to attribute such qualities to them. Excellencies. What falsifies the judgment here is the tendency to idealization. But this very fact helps to guide us. We recognize, in effect, that the object is treated as the subject's own ego and that in falling in love a considerable part of the narcissistic libido passes to the object. In some forms of election, loving, it even becomes evident that the object serves to replace an ideal of its own and not achieved of the self. We love the object because of the perfections to which we have aspired for our own ego and which we would now like to procure for ourselves by this detour, for the satisfaction of our narcissism. As the sexual overestimation and the infatuation are accentuated, the interpretation of the painting becomes easier and easier. The tendencies that aspire to direct sexual satisfaction can suffer a total repression, as happens, for example, almost always, in the passionate love of the adolescent. The eye becomes less and less demanding and more modest, and instead, the object becomes more and more magnificent and precious, until taking over all the love that the eye felt for itself, a process that naturally leads to voluntary and complete sacrifice of the eye. It can be said that the object has devoured the self. In all falling in love, we find traces of humility, a limitation of narcissism and a tendency to diminish itself, traits that are shown to be intensified in extreme cases, until they dominate the entire picture without any competition, due to the disappearance of sensual demands. This is observed more particularly in unhappy, unrequited love, since in shared love each sexual satisfaction is followed by a decrease in the overestimation of the object. Simultaneously with this abandonment of the ego to the object, which is no longer different from the sublimated abandonment of an abstract idea, the functions ascribed to the ego ideal completely disappear. The criticism exerted by this instance is muted, and everything that the object does or demands is good and beyond reproach. The moral conscience ceases to intervene as soon as it is about something that can be favorable to the object, and in the blindness of love, one reaches the point of crime without remorse. The whole situation can be summed up in the following formula: the object has taken the place of the ego ideal. The difference between identification and falling in love in its highest developments, known as fascination and loving servitude, is easy to describe. In the first case, the I is enriched with the qualities of the object, it is introjected according to Ferenczi's expression. In the second, it becomes impoverished, giving itself entirely to the object and substituting its most important component with it. In any case, a careful examination leads us to verify that this description shows non-existent oppositions in reality. From the economic point of view, it is neither enrichment nor impoverishment, since even the most extreme state of love can be described by saying that the I has introjected the object. The following distinction will fall, perhaps, on more essential points. In the case of identification, the object disappears or is abandoned, and is then reconstructed in the I, which is partially modified according to the model of the lost object. In the other case, the object subsists, but it is endowed with all the qualities by the self and at the expense of the self. But neither is this distinction free of objections. Is it indubitable that identification presupposes the cessation of object covering? Can there not very well be identification by conserving the object? But before entering into the discussion of these thorny questions, we already have a feeling that the essence of the situation entails another alternative, that of the object being placed in the place of the ego or in that of the ideal of the ego. From falling in love to hypnosis there is no great distance, its coincidences being evident. The hypnotized gives, with respect to the hypnotist, the same evidence of humble submission, docility, and absence of criticism, that the lover with respect to the object of his love. It is also verified, in both, the same renunciation of all personal initiative. There is no doubt that the hypnotist has placed himself in the place of the ego ideal. The only difference is that in hypnosis, all these particularities are shown to us with greater clarity and relief, so that it will seem more appropriate to explain falling in love by hypnosis and not this one by that one. The hypnotist is for the hypnotized the only object worthy of attention, everything else is erased before him. The fact that the ego experiences everything that the hypnotist demands and affirms as in a dream warns us that we have omitted to mention, among the functions of the ego ideal, the reality testing exercise. It is not surprising that the self considers a perception as real when the psychic instance in charge of testing reality pronounces itself in favor of its reality. The total absence of tendencies for non-restricted sexual purposes contributes to guaranteeing the extreme purity of the phenomena. The hypnotic relationship is a total loving abandonment excluding all sexual satisfaction, while in falling in love, said satisfaction is only temporarily excluded and lasts in the background, as a possible ulterior end. On the other hand, we can also say that the hypnotic relationship is, if we may use the expression, a collective formation made up of two people. Hypnosis lends itself badly to comparison with collective training, since it is rather identical to it. It presents us with an isolated element of the complicated structure of the mass, the attitude of the individual of the mass with respect to the caudillo. By such a limitation of numbers, hypnosis is distinguished from collective formation, just as it is distinguished from falling in love by the absence of direct sexual tendencies. In this way, it comes to occupy an intermediate place between both states. It is very interesting to observe that precisely the sexual tendencies alibi at their end are the ones that create the most lasting bonds between men. But this is easily explained by the fact that they are not capable of complete satisfaction, while the free sexual tendencies are extraordinarily weakened by the discharge that takes effect every time the sexual goal is achieved. Sensual love is destined to be extinguished in satisfaction. In order to be able to last, it must be associated from the beginning with purely tender components, that is, restricted in its ends, or undergo at a given moment, a transposition of this kind. Hypnosis would easily reveal to us the enigma of the libidinous constitution of a crowd if it did not also entail features that escape the rational explanation attempted up to now, according to which it would constitute an infatuation lacking in love. Direct sexual tendencies. In hypnosis there is still, in fact, much that is misunderstood and of a mystical nature. One of its particularities consists of a kind of paralysis resulting from the influence exerted by an omnipotent person on an impotent and defenseless subject, a particularity that brings us closer to the hypnosis caused in animals by terror. The way to provoke hypnosis and its relationship with the dream are not at all transparent, and the enigmatic selection of the appropriate people for it, while others are totally refractory, allows us to suppose that a still unknown condition is realized in hypnosis. Essential for the purity of libidinous attitudes. It is also very noticeable that the moral conscience of hypnotized people can put up intense resistance, simultaneously with the complete suggestive docility of the hypnotized person. But this comes, perhaps, from the fact that in hypnosis, as it is usually practiced, the subject continues realizing that it is nothing but a game, a fictitious reproduction of another situation of much greater vital importance. The foregoing considerations allow us, in any case, to establish the formula for the libidinous constitution of a mass, at least the one that we have been examining up to now, that is, the mass that a caudillo possesses and has not yet acquired, for an organization too perfect, the qualities of an individual. Such a primary mass is a gathering of individuals who have replaced their ego ideal with the same object, as a consequence of which a general and reciprocal identification of the ego has been established among them. The Gregorian instinct. Our illusion of having solved the enigma of the mass with the above formula vanishes after a short time. We did not take long, in fact, to realize that, in reality, we have only retracted the enigma of the mass to the enigma of hypnosis, which, in turn, presents many obscure points. But a new reflection shows us the path that we must now follow. We can tell ourselves that the numerous affective ties given in the mass are certainly enough to explain one of its characteristics, the individual's lack of independence and initiative, the identity of his reaction with that of others, his descent, finally, to the category of integral unit of the multitude. But the latter, considered as a totality, presents still other characteristics, the decrease in intellectual activity, the affectivity exempt from any restraint, the inability to moderate and restrain oneself, the tendency to transgress all limits in the manifestation of the affects and to the complete derivation of these in acts. All these characteristics and other similar ones, of the ones for which Le Bon has drawn such an impressive picture, undoubtedly represent a regression of psychic activity to an earlier phase in which we are not surprised to find the savage or children. Such a regression especially characterizes the ordinary masses, while in the most organized and artificial crowds, as we already know, such regressive characteristics can be considerably attenuated. Thus, we experience the impression of finding ourselves in a situation in which the individual feeling and the personal intellectual act are too weak to assert themselves on their own, without the support of similar affective and intellectual manifestations of other individuals. This reminds us how numerous are the dependency phenomena in human society. Normal, how little originality and how little personal value we find in it, and how far the individual is dominated by the influences of a collective soul, such as racial propriety, class prejudice, public opinion, and so on. The enigma of suggestive influence becomes even darker when we admit that it is exercised not only by the leader over all the individuals in the crowd, but also by each one of them over the others, and we will have to reproach ourselves for the unilateralism with which we have proceeded to highlight almost exclusively the relationship of the individuals of the mass with the caudillo, relegating, on the other hand, to a second term, the factor of reciprocal suggestion. Called, thus, to modesty, we will be inclined to listen to another voice that promises us an explanation based on simpler principles. We take this explanation from the interesting book by W. Trotter on the herd instinct, lamenting only that the author has not managed to escape the antipathy unleashed by the last great war. Trotter derives the psychic phenomena of the mass, previously described, from a gregarious instinct, innate to man as to other animal species. This herd instinct is, from the biological point of view, an analogy, and as an extension of the polycellular structure of higher organisms, and from the point of view of the libido theory, a new manifestation of the libidinous tendency of all humans. Homogeneous beings, to come together in ever larger units. The individual feels incomplete when alone. The anguish of the small child would already be a manifestation of this herd instinct. Opposition to the herd, which rejects everything new and unusual, is separation from it and is therefore fearfully avoided. The herd instinct would be something primary and not susceptible to decomposition, which cannot be split up. Trotter considers as primary the instincts of conservation and nutrition, the sexual instinct and the gregarious. The latter sometimes enters into opposition with the others. The conscience of guilt, reliability and the feeling of duty would be the two characteristic properties of the gregarious animal. According to Trotter, the forces of repression that psychoanalysis has discovered in the ego also emanate from the herd instinct, and consequently also the resistance that the doctor encounters in psychoanalytic treatment. Language owes its importance to the fact that it allows mutual understanding within the herd, and would constitute, to a large extent, the basis for the identification of gregarious individuals. Just as L. E. Bone particularly insists on the passing collective formations, so characteristic, and M.C. Dougal on stable associations, Trotter concentrates all his attention on those more general associations, within which man lives, that's one polit icon who do not understand each other, and tries to establish their psychological basis. Considering the herd instinct as an elemental instinct not susceptible to decomposition, he naturally dispenses with any investigation of its origins, and his observation that Borasides derives it from suggestibility is completely superfluous, fortunately for him, since it deals with an attempt at an explanation that has already been generally rejected as insufficient, being, in our opinion, the opposite proposition, that is, that suggestibility is a product of the herd instinct, much more accurate. Against Trotter's exposition it can be objected, even more justifiably than against the others, that it pays too little attention to the role of the caudillo. On the other hand, we believe it is impossible to reach an understanding of the essence of the crowd by disregarding its leader. The herd instinct leaves no room for the leader, who would not appear in the crowd except by chance. Thus the herd instinct completely excludes the need for a god and leaves the flock without a shepherd. Finally, Trotter's thesis can also be refuted with the help of psychological arguments, that is, it can be made, at least plausible, the hypothesis that the herd instinct is susceptible to decomposition, not being primary in the same sense as the instincts of conservation and sexual. It is, naturally, not at all easy to pursue the ontogenesis of the herd instinct. The fear that the small child experiences when left alone, and which Trotter already considers as a manifestation of the herd instinct, is susceptible to another, more plausible interpretation. It is the expression of an unsatisfied desire, whose object is the mother and later, another familiar person, a desire that the child only knows how to transform into anguish. This anguish of the child who has been left alone, far from being appeased by the appearance of any man of the flock, is provoked or intensified by the sight of one of these strangers. Furthermore, the child does not show for a long time any sign of a herd instinct or of a collective feeling. Both begin to form little by little in the nursery, as effects of the relationships between children and their parents, and precisely as a reaction to the envy with which the eldest son initially welcomes the intrusion of a new little brother. The first would jealously suppress the second, alienating him from his parents and depriving him of all his rights, but given the positive fact that this little brother, like all subsequent ones, is equally loved by his parents, and as a result of the impossibility of maintaining his own life without harm, hostile attitude, the little subject is forced to identify with the other children, and in the children's group a collective or community feeling is then formed, which then experiences, in the school, a further development. The first demand of this reaction formation is that of justice and equal treatment for all. It is well known with what force and what solidarity this claim is manifested in the school. Since oneself cannot be the favorite, at least, that nobody is. This transformation of jealousy into a collective feeling among the children of a family or of a school class would seem implausible if we did not observe the same process again later, and under different circumstances. Remember the crowd of women and girls romantically in love with a singer or a pianist who crowd around him at the end of a concert. Each of them could feel justifiably jealous of the others, but given their number and the consequent impossibility of completely capturing the man they love, they all renounce it, and instead of pulling out each other's hair, they act as a supportive crowd, offer their common homage to the idol, and would even consider themselves happy if they could distribute among all the locks of her curly hair. Rivals at first, they have later been able to identify with each other by the same love they profess for the same object. When an instinctive situation is susceptible to different outcomes, as is actually the case, with most of them, we will not be surprised that the one with which the possibility of a certain satisfaction appears linked occurs, instead of another or others that we believe to be more natural, but at those that the real circumstances prevent achieving that end. All those manifestations of this order, which we later find in society, such as camaraderie, esprit de corps, etc., are also derived, indisputably, from primitive envy. No one should want to stand out, they should all be and get the same. Social justice means that we deny ourselves many things, so that others also have to give them up, or what is the same, they cannot claim them. This demand for equality is the root of social consciousness and the feeling of duty, and it is also revealed in a totally unexpected way in the anxiety of infection of syphilitic patients, an anguish to which psychoanalysis has led us to understand, showing us that it corresponds to the violent struggle of these unfortunates against their unconscious desire to communicate their illness to others, for why should they alone suffer the fearsome infection that prohibits them from so many joys, while others are healthy and participate in all the pleasures? The beautiful anecdote of Solomon's trial also contains the same nodule. Since my son has been taken from me by death, thinks one of the women, why should she keep hers? This desire is enough for the king to recognize the woman who has lost her son. Thus, social sentiment rests on the transformation of a primitively hostile sentiment into a positive bond of the nature of an identification. As soon as we can follow the process of this transformation, we think we observe that it is carried out under the influence of a common bond, based on tenderness, to a person outside the crowd. We are very far from considering our analysis of identification complete, but for our purpose it is enough to have highlighted the requirement of absolute and consistent equality. With regard to the two artificial masses, the Church and the Army, we have seen that their prior condition consists in the fact that all their members are equally loved by a leader. Now, we must not forget that the demand for equality formulated by the masses refers only to the individuals who constitute it, not to the boss. All individuals want to be equal, but under the rule of a leader. Many equals, capable of identifying with each other, and a single superior, such is the situation that we find realized in the mass endowed with vitality. Thus, then, we will allow ourselves to correct Trotter's conception, saying that more than a gregarious animal, is man a herd animal, that is, a constituent element of a horde led by a chief. The mass and the primitive horde. In 1912, I adopted Ch. Darwin's hypothesis, according to which the primitive form of human society would have been the horde subjected to the absolute domination of a powerful male. At that time, I tried to demonstrate that the destinies of said horde have left indelible traces in the hereditary history of humanity, and above all, that the evolution of totemism, which encompasses the beginnings of religion, morality, and social differentiation, it is related to the violent death of the chief and to the transformation of the paternal horde into a brotherly community. This is nothing more than a new hypothesis to add to the many constructed by historians of primitive humanity, to try to clarify the darkness of prehistory, a just so story, as a kind English critic, Kroger, jokingly called it, but I consider it already very honorable, for a hypothesis, the one that like this one, proves appropriate to relate and explain facts belonging to increasingly distant sectors. Now, the human masses show us again the picture, already known, of the individual endowed with extraordinary power and dominating the multitude of individuals equal to each other, a picture that corresponds exactly to our representation of the primitive horde. The psychology of these masses, as is known to us from the repeatedly mentioned descriptions, the disappearance of the conscious individual personality, the orientation of thoughts and feelings in the same direction, the predominance of affectivity and unconscious psychic life, the tendency to the immediate realization of the intentions that may arise. All this psychology, we repeat, corresponds to a state of regression to a primitive mental activity, just as we would attribute it to the prehistoric horde. The mass appears to us, then, as a resurrection of the primitive horde. Just as primitive man survives in virtually every individual, so every human mass can reconstitute the primitive horde. We will therefore have to deduce that collective psychology is the oldest human psychology. That set of elements that we have isolated from everything related to the mass, to constitute individual psychology, has not differentiated itself from the old collective psychology until later, very little by little, and even today only partially. We will still try to indicate the starting point of this evolution. The first reflection that arises in our spirit shows us at what point we will have to rectify our previous statements. Individual psychology must, in fact, be at least as old as collective psychology, since from the beginning there must have been two psychologies, that of the individual components of the mass and that of the father, boss, or caudillo. The individuals of the mass were linked to each other in the same way as today, but the father of the horde remained free, and even being isolated, his intellectual acts were energetic and independent. His will did not need to be reinforced by that of others. We will deduce, then, that his ego was not closely bound by libidinous ties and that, loving himself above all, he only loved others insofar as they served him for the satisfaction of his needs. His I did not give objects more than what was strictly necessary. At the dawn of human history, the father of the primitive horde was the Superman whose advent Nietzsche awaited in the distant future. The individuals that make up a mass still need the illusion that the boss loves them all with a just and equitable love, while the boss himself does not need to love anyone. He can set himself up as lord and master, and although absolutely narcissistic, he is sure of himself and enjoys complete independence. We already know that narcissism limits love, and we could demonstrate that by doing so, it has become a very important factor of civilization. The father of the primitive horde was not yet immortal as he later became by divinization. When he died he had to be replaced, and it was probably by the youngest of his sons, who until then had been an individual of the mass, like the others. There must, then, be a possibility of transforming collective psychology into individual psychology and of finding the conditions in which such a transformation can take place, analogously to the way in which bees can make a queen emerge from a larva, if necessary, instead of a worker. The only hypothesis that we can build on this point is the following: the primitive father prevented his children from satisfying their direct sexual tendencies, he imposed abstinence on them, and therefore by way of derivation, the establishment of affective ties that linked them to him in the first place, and then to each other. It can be said that he imposed collective psychology on them and that this psychology is not, in the last analysis, but a product of their sexual jealousy and intolerance. Before his successor, the possibility of sexual satisfaction opened up, and with it, his liberation from the conditions of collective psychology. The fixation of the libido to the woman, and the possibility of satisfying sexual needs immediately and without delay, diminished the importance of alibi sexual tendencies in their end and raised the level of narcissism. In the last chapter of this work, we will return to this relationship of love with the formation of character. We will also highlight, as especially instructive, the relationship between the constitution of the primitive horde and the organization that maintains and ensures the cohesion of an artificial mass. We have already seen that the army and the church rest on the illusion that the boss loves all individuals equally. But this is nothing other than the idealistic transformation of the conditions of the primitive horde, in which all the children know they are equally persecuted by the Father, who inspires them all with the same fear. Already the immediate form of human society, the totemic clan, rests on this transformation, which in turn constitutes the basis of all social duties. The unbreakable strength of the family, as a natural collective formation. It results from the fact that in her the equal love of the father towards all the children is an effective reality. But this reference of the mass to the primitive horde has to offer us even more interesting lessons. It has to explain to us what is still misunderstood and mysterious in the collective formation, what is hidden behind the enigmatic concepts of hypnosis and suggestion. Let us remember that hypnosis carries within itself something disturbing and that this character always indicates the existence of a repression of something old and familiar. Let us also remember that hypnosis is an induced state. The hypnotist claims to possess a mysterious power that strips the subject of his will. Or what is the same, the subject attributes to the hypnotist such a power. This mysterious force, which is still vulgarly called animal magnetism, must be the same as that which constitutes, for primitives, the source of taboo, that same force that emanates from kings and chiefs and that endangers those who approach them, mana. The hypnotist, who claims to possess this force, uses it by ordering the subject to look into his eyes. He hypnotizes, in a typical way, through his gaze. Likewise, it is the view of the chief that is dangerous and untenable for the primitive, as later that of God for the believer. Moses is forced to serve as an intermediary between Jehovah and his people, because the latter cannot bear the sight of God, and when he returns from Sinai, his face shines, because as also happens to the intermediary of the primitives, a part of the manna has passed to his person. Hypnosis can also be brought about by other means by making the subject stare at a shiny object or listen to a monotonous noise, and this circumstance has misled many, giving rise to insufficient physiological theories. In reality, these procedures serve nothing more than to divert and fix the conscious attention. It is as if the hypnotist said to the subject, "Now you are going to deal exclusively with me, the rest of the world is of no interest." It is clear that this speech, actually delivered by the hypnotist, would have to be counterproductive from the point of view technical, since its only consequence would be to tear the subject out of his unconscious disposition and excite him to conscious contradiction. But while the hypnotist avoids attracting the conscious thought of the subject to his intentions and he falls into an activity in which the world must seem devoid of all interest to him, it happens that, in reality, he unconsciously concentrates all his attention on the hypnotist, entering in transfer state with him. The indirect methods of hypnotism thus produce, like some joke techniques, the effect of preventing certain distributions of psychic energy, which would disturb the evolution of the unconscious process, and finally lead to the same result as the direct influences exerted by the gaze, or by the passes. Ferenczi has rightly deduced that with the order to sleep, intimidating the subject at the start of hypnosis, the hypnotist is placed in the place of his parents. He also believes that he distinguishes two kinds of hypnosis, one caressing and appeasing, and the other threatening. The first would be maternal hypnosis, the second, parental hypnosis. Now, the order to sleep does not mean, in hypnosis, but the invitation to withdraw all interest from the outside world and concentrate it on the person of the hypnotist. This is how the subject understands it, in effect, since this diversion of attention from the outside world constitutes the psychological characteristic of the dream, and in it rests the kinship of the dream with the hypnotic state. By means of these procedures, the hypnotist awakens, then, a part of the archaic heritage of the subject, a heritage that was already manifested in his attitude towards his parents and especially in his idea of the father, whom he had to represent as a omnipotent and dangerous personality, in relation to which it was only possible to observe a passive masochistic attitude, renouncing all his own will and considering as a risky audacity the fact of daring his presence. Such must have been, undoubtedly, the attitude of the individual of the primitive horde towards the father. As other reactions have already shown us, personal aptitude for resurrection from such archaic situations varies greatly from one individual to another. In any case, the individual may retain an awareness that, deep down, hypnosis is nothing but a game, an illusory revival of those ancient impressions, an awareness that is sufficient to give rise to resistance against the too serious consequences of the hypnotic suppression of hypnosis. Willpower. The disturbing and coercive character of the collective formations, which manifests itself in their suggestive phenomena, can therefore be attributed to the affinity of the mass with the primitive horde, from which it descends. The caudillo is still the dreaded primitive father. The masses always want to be dominated by unlimited power. Avid for authority, it has, in the words of Gustavo Le Bon, an inexhaustible thirst for submission. The primitive father is the ideal of the mass, and this ideal dominates the individual, replacing his ego ideal. Hypnosis can be designated as a collective training of only two people. In order to apply this definition to suggestion, we will have to complete it, adding that in said group of two people, it is necessary for the subject who experiences the suggestion to possess a conviction not based on perception or reasoning, but on an erotic bond. A phase of the me. When we go on to examine the life of the individual of our days, keeping in mind the various complementary descriptions of collective psychology that the authors have given us, we see a very appropriate accumulation of complications arise to discourage any attempt at synthesis. Each individual is part of several masses, is linked, by identification, in many different ways, and has built his ideal of the self according to the most different models. In this way, he participates in many collective souls, those of his race, his social class, his confessional community, his state, etc., and can, furthermore, rise to a certain degree of originality and independence. Such permanent and lasting collective formations produce uniform effects, which do not impose themselves as strongly on the observer as the manifestations of the rapidly forming, passing masses that have provided Le Bon with the elements of his brilliant characteristic of the collective soul, and precisely in these noisy and ephemeral crowds, superimposed, so to speak, on the others, it is in them that the miracle of the complete, albeit temporary, disappearance of all individual particularity is observed. We have tried to explain this miracle, supposing that the individual renounces his ideal of the I, exchanging it for the ideal of the mass, embodied in the caudillo. We will add, by way of rectification, that the miracle is not equally great in all cases. The divorce between the I and the ideal of the I is not very marked in many individuals. Both instances still appear almost confused and the I still retains its previous narcissistic self-satisfaction. The election of the caudillo is considerably facilitated in these circumstances. It will suffice that he possesses, with special relief, the typical qualities of such individuals and that he gives the impression of considerable strength. Flexible and a great libidinous freedom, so that the need for an energetic leader comes to meet him and clothes him with an omnipotence to which perhaps he would never have aspired. Those other individuals, whose ego ideal does not find a fully satisfactory embodiment in the person of the boss, are then carried along suggestively, that is, by identification. We recognize that our contribution to the elucidation of the libidinal structure of a mass is reduced to the distinction between the ego and the ego ideal and the consequent double nature of the ligament, identification and substitution of the ego ideal by an external object. The hypothesis that this phase of the self postulates and which, as such, constitutes the first step in the analysis of the self, will gradually find its justification in the most diverse sectors of psychology. In my study Introduction to Narcissism, I have tried to gather the pathological data on which the aforementioned distinction can be supported, and everything leads us to hope that a more in-depth study of psychosis will bring out its importance particularly. It is enough to reflect that the I enters, from this moment, into the relation of an object with the ideal of the I developed by it, and that probably all the reciprocal effects developed between the external object and the total I, as it has been revealed the theory of neurosis, are now reproduced within the ego. I do not propose to examine here but one of the possible consequences of this point of view, and with it, to continue the clarification of a problem that in another place I had to leave unexplained. Each one of the psychic differentiations discovered represents one more difficulty for the mental function, increases its instability and can constitute the starting point of its failure, that is, a disease. Thus, birth represents the passage from a narcissism that is completely self-sufficient, to the perception of a variable external world and to the first discovery of objects. From this too radical transition, it results that we are not able to endure the new state created by birth for a long time, and we periodically escape from it, to find again, in sleep, our previous state of impassivity and isolation from the outside world. This return to the previous state is certainly also the result of an adaptation to the external world, which, with the periodic succession of day and night, suppresses for a certain time most of the excitations that act on us. A second case of this kind, more important for pathology, does not appear to be subject to any similar limitation. In the course of our development, we have made a differentiation of our psychic composition into a coherent I and an unconscious, repressed I, outside of it, and we know that the stability of this new acquisition is exposed to incessant upheavals. In dreams and in neurosis, said banished I tries, by all means, to force the doors of consciousness, protected by various resistances, and in the state of waking health, we resort to particular artifices, to welcome into our I, the repressed, eluding resistance and experiencing an increase in pleasure. The joke, the humor, and in part, also, the comic, must be considered from this point of view. Any connoisseur of the psychology of neurosis will easily recall numerous similar examples, albeit of a lesser scope. But, leaving this question aside, we will move on to the application of our results. We can perfectly admit that the separation operated between the I and the ideal of the I, cannot be supported for a long time either and must experience, from time to time, a regression. Despite all the privations and restrictions imposed on the self, the periodic violation of the prohibitions constitutes the general rule, as shown by the institution of festivals, which at first were only periods during which all events were permitted by law. Excesses, circumstances that explain his characteristic joy. The Saturnalia of the Romans and our modern carnival coincide in this essential feature with the festivals of the primitives, during which individuals are given over to orgies in which they violate the most sacred commandments. The ideal of the ego encompasses the sum of all the restrictions to which the ego must yield, and in this way, the return of the ideal to the ego must constitute for the latter, which finds contentment with itself again, a magnificent celebration. The coincidence of the ego with the ego ideal always produces a sensation of triumph. The feeling of guilt, or inferiority, can be considered as the expression of a state of tension between the self and the ideal. It is known that there are individuals whose general affective state oscillates periodically, going from an exaggerated depression to a sensation of extreme well-being, through a certain intermediate stage. These oscillations have very different amplitudes, from the most imperceptible to the most extreme, as in the cases of melancholy and mania, states that torment or profoundly disturb the life of the attacked subject. In the typical cases of these cyclical affective states, external occasions do not seem to play a decisive role. Nor do we find in these patients internal motives more numerous than in others or different from them. Thus, it has become the custom to consider these cases as non-psychogenic. Later on we will deal with other totally analogous cases of cyclical affective states, which can easily be reduced to psychic traumas. The reasons that determine these spontaneous oscillations of affective states are thus unknown. We also ignore the mechanism by which a mania is replaced by a melancholy. Thus, these would be the patients to whom our hypothesis could be applied that their ego ideal is periodically confused with their ego, after having exerted a rigorous control over it. In order to avoid any obscurity, we must remember the following: from the point of view of our analysis of the ego, it is unquestionable that in the maniac, the ego and the ego ideal are confused, so that the subject, dominated out of a feeling of triumph and satisfaction, undisturbed by any criticism, he feels free of all inhibitions and sheltered from all reproach or remorse. Less obvious, but also plausible, is that the misery of the melancholic constitutes the expression of a very sharp opposition between the two instances of the self, an opposition in which the ideal, excessively sensitive, relentlessly manifests its condemnation of the self, with the mania for belittling and self-abasement. The only question is whether the cause of these modified relations between the ego and the ideal of the ego must be sought in the periodic rebellions that we dealt with before, against the new institution, or in other circumstances. The transformation into mania is not an indispensable feature of the pathological picture of melancholic depression. There are simple melancholies, of a unique axis, and periodic melancholies, which never run such luck. But on the other hand, there are melancholies in which external occasions play an obvious etiological role, thus, those that occur after the loss of a loved one, either by death or as a consequence of circumstances that have forced the libido to detach itself from an object. In the same way as spontaneous melancholia, these psychogenic melancholia can transform into mania and then return to melancholia again, repeating this cycle several times. The situation is therefore quite obscure, all the more so since up to now only very few cases and forms of melancholia have been subjected to psychoanalytic investigation. The only cases to which we have already come to understand are those in which the object is abandoned because it has proved itself unworthy of love. In them, the object is then reconstituted in the I, by identification, and is severely judged by the ideal of the I. The reproaches and attacks directed against the object then manifest themselves in the form of melancholic reproaches against the person himself. Also a melancholy of this last kind can be transformed into mania, so that this possibility represents a particularity independent of the other characters of the pathological picture. I see no difficulty in introducing into the explanation of the two kinds of melancholy, the psychogenic and the spontaneous, the factor of the periodic rebellion of the ego against the ideal of the ego. In the spontaneous ones, it can be admitted that the ego ideal manifests a tendency to develop a particular severity, which then automatically results in its temporary suppression. In psychogenic melancholy, the ego would be incited to rebellion due to the mistreatment of its ideal in cases of identification with a rejected object. Supplementary considerations. In the course of our research, which has come to a provisional end here, we have seen various very promising prospects open up before us, but in order not to stray from our main path, we have had to leave them unexplored. In this last chapter of our study, we want to return to them and subject them to a quick investigation. A. The distinction between the identification of the self and the substitution of the ideal of the self by the object finds a very interesting illustration in the two great artificial masses that we have previously studied, the army and the Christian church. It is evident that the soldier converts his superior, that is, in the last analysis, the head of the army, into his ideal, while, on the other hand, he identifies with his equals and deduces from this community of the I the obligations of camaraderie. That is, mutual aid and community of goods. But if you try to identify with the boss, you'll only make a fool of yourself. Thus, in the first part of Schiller's Wallenstein, the hunter-soldier mocks the cavalry sergeant, saying to him, "We are Rospert und we are spukt, das habt ihr ihm glücklich abgeguckt." The same is not true of the Catholic Church. Every Christian loves Christ as his ideal and is bound by identification to other Christians. But the Church demands more of him. He is to identify with Christ and love other Christians as Christ was to love them. The Church therefore demands that the libidinous disposition created by the collective formation be completed in two senses. The identification must accumulate to the choice of object and the love of the identification. This double complement evidently goes beyond the constitution of the mass. You can be a good Christian without ever having had the idea of placing yourself in the place of Christ and extending, like him, his love to all humans. Man, a weak creature, cannot claim to rise to the greatness of soul and the capacity for love of Christ. But this development of the distribution of the libido in the mass is probably the factor on which Christianity bases its claim to have achieved a superior morality. b. We said that it was possible to determine, in the psychic development of humanity, the moment in which the individual passed from collective psychology to individual psychology. To clarify this statement, we will have to quickly return to the scientific myth concerning the father of the primitive horde, who was later elevated to the category of creator of the world, an elevation fully justified, since he was the one who fathered all the children who made up the first crew. For each of these children, the father was the ideal both feared and revered, the source of the later notion of taboo. But one day, they got together, killed the father and tore him to pieces. However, none of them could take the place of the vanquished, and if any tried to do so, they saw the same hostility rise up against them, renewing the fights, until they were all convinced that they had to renounce their father's inheritance. Then, they constituted the totemic fraternal community, whose members all enjoyed the same rights and were subject to totemic prohibitions, which had to preserve the memory of the crime and impose its atonement. But this new order of things also provoked general discontent, out of which a new evolution arose. Little by little, the members of the fraternal mass approached the restoration of the old state according to a new plan. The man once again assumed the leadership, but only that of a family, and put an end to the privileges of the matriarchal regime, established after the supremacy of the family. Father's Zion. By way of compensation, he recognized, perhaps, then, the maternal divinities, served by priests who suffered castration, for the mother's guarantee and according to the example previously given by the father. However, the new family was only a shadow of the old, since there were many parents, the freedom of each one was limited by the rights of the others. The discontent caused by these deprivations could then decide an individual to separate himself from the mass and assume the role of the father. He who did this was the first epic poet, and the progress in question was made only in his fancy. This poet transformed reality in the sense of his desires, and thus invented the heroic myth. The hero was the one who, without any help, had killed his father, who still appears in myth as a totemic monster. Just as the father had been the first ideal of the adolescent, the poet now created, with the hero who aspires to supplant the father, the first ideal of the ego. The idea of the hero is probably linked to the personality of the youngest of the sons, who, preferred by the mother and protected by her against paternal jealousy, was the one who succeeded the father in primitive times. The poetic elaboration of the realities of these times probably transformed the woman, who had been nothing but the prize of the fight and the reason for the murder, into an instigator and active accomplice of it. The myth attributes exclusively to the hero the feat that had to be the work of the entire horde. But as Rank has observed, the legend preserves very clear traces of the real situation, poetically distorted. In fact, it frequently happens that the hero who has to carry out a great undertaking, generally the youngest son, who, before the father's surrogate, has often pretended to be an idiot, that is, harmless, cannot carry it out except with the help of a multitude of animals, bees, ants. These animals would only be the symbolic representation of the brothers of the primitive horde, in the same way that in the symbolism of the dream, the insects and the parasites represent the brothers and sisters of the subject, considered contemptuously as small children. In addition, in each of the companies that myths and fables speak of, a substitution of the heroic deed can be easily recognized. Thus, the myth constitutes the step with which the individual separates from collective psychology. The first myth was surely of a psychological order, the myth of the hero. The explanatory myth of nature did not emerge until later. The poet who took this step and thus separated himself, imaginatively, from the crowd, nevertheless knows how to find, in reality, according to another observation by Rank, the return to it, going to recount to the masses the feats that his imagination he attributes a hero invented by him, a hero who, deep down, is nothing other than himself. In this way, the poet returns to reality, raising his listeners to the height of his imagination. But listeners know how to understand the poet and can identify with the hero thanks to the fact that they share his attitude, full of unrealized wishes, towards the primitive father. The lie of the heroic myth culminates in the divinization of the hero. It is very possible that the deified hero is prior to the God-Father, and constitutes the precursor of the return of the primitive father as divinity. The divinities would have, then, succeeded each other in the following chronological order: Mother Goddess, Father Heroes. But until the elevation of the primitive father, never forgotten, the divinity did not acquire the features that it shows us today. See. We have frequently spoken in the course of this work, of direct sexual instincts and of sexual instincts restricted in their end, and we hope that this disposition has not raised too many objections in the reader. However, we believe it convenient to return to it here, more carefully, even at the risk of repeating what has already been stated in other places. The first and most complete example of sexual instincts cut short at their end has been offered to us by the evolution of the libido in the child. All the feelings that the child experiences for his parents and guardians, endure without any limitation, in the desires that externalize their sexual tendencies. The child demands from these loved ones, all the tenderness that is known to him. He wants to kiss them, touch them, and contemplate them. He harbors the curiosity to see his genital organs and assist in the performance of his most intimate functions. He promises to marry his mother or his nursemaid. Whatever his idea of marriage may be, he intends to have a child by his father, etc. Both direct observation and subsequent analytical examination of the infant remains leave no doubt about the coexistence of tender and jealous feelings and sexual intentions, and show us to what extent the child makes the loved person the object of all his tendencies. Sexual, still poorly centered. This first form that love takes on in the child, and that is intimately related to the Oedipus complex, succumbs, as we already know, at the beginning of the latency period, under the empire of repression, leaving nothing but an affective bond, purely tender, to the same people, a link that can no longer be described as sexual. Psychoanalysis, which illuminates the depths of mental life, demonstrates without difficulty that the sexual relations of the first childhood years also continue to subsist, although repressed and unconscious, and authorizes us to affirm that all tender feelings constitute the succession of a relationship fully sensual to the corresponding person or their symbolic representation, imago. Of course, a special investigation is necessary to ascertain whether in a given case this previous sexual current still exists in a state of repression or whether it has completely disappeared. Or to be more precise, it has been shown that said current still exists as form and possibility and is capable of being activated at any moment as a result of a regression. It's just a question of knowing, and we don't always get it, what its current charge and effectiveness are. In this investigation we will have to avoid two pitfalls alike: insufficient estimation of the repressed unconscious and the tendency to apply to the normal the criteria that we apply to the pathological. Before psychology, which does not want or cannot penetrate into the depths of the repressed, the movements affective of a tender nature as an expression of tendencies exempt from any sexual character, although they have arisen from others whose purpose was sexuality. We can rightly affirm that such tendencies have been diverted from said sexual aims, although it is difficult to describe this deviation from the aim according to the requirements of metapsychology. In any case, these instincts restricted in their purpose still retain some of their primitive sexual purposes. The affectionate man, the friend, and the admirer also seek bodily proximity and the sight of the loved person, but with a love of Paulinine meaning. We can see in this deviation from the end a principle of sublimation of the sexual instincts, or even further remove the limits of the latter. Restricted sexual instincts have a great functional advantage over non-restricted ones. Not being capable of total satisfaction, they are particularly suitable for creating lasting bonds, while the direct sexual instincts lose, after each satisfaction, a large part of their energy, and in the interval between this weakening and their rebirth by a new accumulation of libido, the object may be replaced by another. The restrained instincts can mix in any measure with the unrestricted ones and return to the latter after having arisen from them. It is well known how easily effective relationships of a friendly nature based on recognition and admiration, such as those established between the master and the female disciples or between the artist and his admirers, transform, especially in women, into erotic desires. Remember Molière's Embrassez-moi pour l'amour du grec. The very birth of these effective bonds, unintentional at first, opens a very frequented path to the sexual choice of object. In The Piety of the Count of Zinzendorf, Pfister has shown with an impressive example, and which is surely not the only one, the ease with which an intense religious bond is transformed into burning sexual desire. On the other hand, the transformation of direct sexual tendencies, ephemeral in themselves, into simply tender lasting ties, is a common occurrence, and the consolidation of marriages contracted under the auspices of passionate love rests almost entirely on this transformation. We will not be surprised to find out that the sexual tendencies restricted in their end arise from the directly sexual ones when internal or external obstacles oppose the achievement of the sexual ends. The repression that takes effect in the latency period is one such internal obstacle. We said before, that the father of the primitive horde, with his sexual intolerance, condemned all his children to abstinence, thus imposing on them restricted liaisons at the end, while, for his part, he reserved free sexual pleasure and remained, thus, independent of any ligament. All the links in which the mass rests are of the nature of the instincts restricted in their end. But with this we have approached the discussion of a new topic, the relationship of direct sexual instincts with collective formation. D. The last two observations already allow us to glimpse that direct sexual tendencies are unfavorable for collective formation. In the course of the evolution of the family, there have certainly been collective sexual relations, group marriage, but the more important sexual love became for the ego, and the more capable of love the individual, the more he tended to limit himself. Of love for two people one come one a limitation that seems prescribed by the modality of the genital end. Polygamous inclinations had to be content with the successive substitution of one object for another. The two people brought together to achieve sexual satisfaction constitute, due to their desire for solitude, a living argument against the herd instinct and collective feeling. The more in love they are, the more completely they are enough for each other. The rejection of the influence of the masses is externalized as a feeling of modesty. The violent emotions aroused by jealousy serve to protect the sexual choice of object against the influence that a collective bond might exert on it. Only when the tender and therefore personal factor of the love relationship that disappears completely when faced with the sexual factor, it is when the public love affair of a couple or the performance of simultaneous sexual acts within a group becomes possible, as happens in an orgy. But there is thus a regression to an earlier state of sexual relations, in which love itself played no role yet, and all sexual objects were given equal value, roughly in the sense of Bernard Shaw's malignant phrase. Being in love means disproportionately exaggerating the difference between one woman and another. There are numerous facts that testify that falling in love did not appear until quite late in the sexual relations between a man and a woman, resulting in the fact that the opposition between sexual love and the collective bond would also have developed late. This hypothesis may seem at first sight incompatible with our myth of the primitive family. According to him, the brotherly horde had to be incited to parricide by love for mothers and sisters, and it is difficult to represent this love in any other way than as a primitive and complete love, that is, as an intimate union of tender and sex love. But reflecting more carefully, we find that this objection is not really but a confirmation. One of the reactions provoked by parricide was the institution of totemic exogamy, the prohibition of all sexual contact with the women of the family, loved since childhood. In this way, there was a split between the tender feelings and the sensual feelings of man, a split whose effects are still felt today. As a result of this exogamy, the man was forced to satisfy his sexual needs with women who were strangers to him and who did not inspire him with any love. In the great artificial masses, the church and the army, there is no place for women as sexual objects. The loving relationship between man and woman is left out of these organizations. Even in crowds made up of men and women, sexual differences play no role. It makes no sense to ask if the libido that maintains the cohesion of the multitudes is of a homosexual or heterosexual nature, since the mass is not differentiated according to the sexes and makes an abstraction, particularly, of the ends of the genital organization of the libido. Direct sexual tendencies retain a certain character of individuality even in the individual absorbed by the mass. When this individuality exceeds a certain degree, the collective formation is disintegrated. The Catholic Church had the best reasons to recommend celibacy to its faithful and to impose it on its priests, but love has also led many clergymen to leave the Church. In the same way, the love of women breaks the collective ties of race, nationality, and social class and thus carries out a very important work of civilization. It seems indisputable that homosexual love is better adapted to collective ties even where it appears as an unfettered sexual tendency, a singular fact whose explanation would take us a long way. The psychoanalytic examination of the psychoneuroses has taught us that their symptoms derive from repressed sexual tendencies, but that they remain active. We can complete this formula by adding, these symptoms can also be derived from sexual tendencies alibi in their end, but alibis in an incomplete way or that makes possible a return to the repressed sexual end. This circumstance explains why neurosis makes the individual asocial, extracting him from the habitual collective formations. It can be said that neurosis is, for multitudes, a factor of disintegration to the same degree as love. Thus, we observe inversely that whenever an energetic tendency towards collective formation is manifested, the neuroses are attenuated and even disappear, at least for a time. Thus, justifiably, attempts have been made to use this opposition between neurosis and collective formation for a therapeutic purpose. Even those who do not lament the disappearance of religious illusions in the modern civilized world will agree that as long as such illusions remain, they were their strength, they constituted, for those who lived under their sway, the strongest protection against the danger of neurosis. It is also not difficult to recognize in all adherences to sects or mystical religious or philosophical communities, the manifestation of the desire to find an indirect remedy against various neuroses. All this is related to the opposition between direct sexual tendencies and alibi sexual tendencies in their end. Left to himself, the neurotic is forced to replace the great collective formations, from which he finds himself excluded, by his own symptomatic formations. It creates its own imaginary world, its religion, and its delusional system and thus reproduces the institutions of humanity in a disfigured aspect, which betrays the powerful contribution made by direct sexual tendencies. Before finishing, we will outline, placing ourselves in the point of view of the libido, a comparative chart of the various states that we have dealt with: falling in love, hypnosis, collective formation, and neurosis. Falling in love rests on the coexistence of direct sexual tendencies and alibi sexual tendencies at its end, the object attracting to itself a part of the narcissistic libido of the ego. In this state there is no room but the I and the object. Hypnosis shares with falling in love the limitation to such two people, the object and the yaporo, but it relies totally on sexual tendencies restricted in its end and places the object in the place of the ideal of the I. The mass multiplies this process, coincides with hypnosis in the nature of the instincts that maintain its cohesion and in the substitution of the ego ideal for the object, but adds to it the identification with other individuals, facilitated, perhaps primitively, by the equality of attitude towards the object. These last two states, hypnosis and collective formation, are hereditary residues of the phylogenesis of the human libido. Hypnosis would have subsisted as a disposition, and the mass, moreover, as direct survival. The replacement of direct sexual tendencies by alibis favors, in these two states, the separation between the self and the ideal of the self, a separation that already began in falling in love. Neurosis separates from this series. It, too, rests on a particularity of the evolution of the human libido, on the double articulation of the direct sexual function, interrupted by the latency period. In this aspect, it shares with hypnosis and group training the regressive character that falling in love lacks. It occurs whenever the passage from the direct sexual instincts to the restricted sexual instincts has not been able to be fully carried out, and it corresponds to a conflict between the instincts received in the ego that have carried out such evolution and the fractions of said same instincts that from the unconscious repressed, and like other totally repressed instinctual movements tend to their direct satisfaction. Neurosis has a very rich content, since it involves all the possible relations between the ego and the object, both those in which the object is conserved and those in which it is abandoned or erected in the ego, and on the other hand, the relations emanating from conflicts between the ego and the ideal of the ego. End. Psychology of the Masses and Analysis of the Self. Sigmund Freud.